What happens when small-town secrets refuse to stay buried? Tonight, we're diving into 11 authenticated accounts from the Pacific Northwest's most isolated communities. Disappearances that defy explanation, institutional cover-ups spanning decades, and encounters that shattered ordinary lives. These aren't campfire tales. These are documented experiences from real people who witnessed something profoundly wrong. Drop your location and current time in the comments below. Let's see where Bleak Fears viewers are watching from tonight. Remember to subscribe, because tomorrow night's episode reveals something even darker. My name is Cade, and I'm 52 years old. I spent 28 years working for the Forest Service in the Pacific Northwest before I took early retirement in 2006. People ask me why I left with a full pension still years away, and I always give them the same answer about wanting to spend more time with family. That's only half true. The real reason is something I've kept to myself for almost 3 decades now. Something that happened in the fall of 1998 that I've never been able to explain or forget. I was stationed out of the Forks Ranger District on the Olympic Peninsula back then. If you know anything about logging in Washington, you know that Forks sits right in the heart of some of the densest old-growth forest left in the lower 48. The timber companies had been working that area hard since the 50s, but by the 90s, most of the accessible old growth was protected or already cut. What remained were isolated pockets in restricted zones, areas we kept off limits for erosion control, watershed protection, or because the terrain was just too dangerous to work. It was October 15th when I got the call. A helicopter pilot doing a routine fire watch flyover had spotted active logging equipment in Section 12, which was a restricted old-growth area about 14 miles northeast of town. Section 12 had been off-limits since 1985, after a slope failure killed 2 workers from a different crew. The whole area was geologically unstable, and we'd pulled all the permits. Nobody should have been anywhere near there. I radioed it in and headed out with my partner at the time, a guy named Ellis, who transferred to Montana a year later. The access road was grown over in places, and we had to cut through some downed timber to get the truck within a mile of the site. The rest we did on foot. I remember the forest was absolutely silent that day, which struck me as odd even then. Usually you'd hear ravens, woodpeckers, something, but there was nothing except our boots on the wet ground and our own breathing. We found the equipment about 2 hours after we started hiking, a Caterpillar 320 excavator, relatively new from what I could tell, sitting right at the edge of a cutting zone. The engine was still running. I checked my watch. It was nearly 3 in the afternoon. The strange thing was that the machine was positioned mid-operation. The arm was extended with the grapple holding a section of log, frozen in place, like someone had just stepped away for a minute. Ellis approached the cab while I radioed back to the office. That's when he called me over. The operator's door was open, swinging slightly in the breeze that had just picked up. Inside the cab, everything looked normal. Too normal. There was a lunchbox on the passenger seat, opened. A sandwich with 1 bite taken out of it. A thermos cup still steaming with what I later confirmed was coffee. The radio was on, and here's what made my skin crawl. It was mid-transmission. Not static. Not silence. Mid-transmission. A voice was coming through, dispatch asking for a location check, asking if anyone could hear them. But there was no operator, no one in the cab, no one standing nearby. We called out, thinking maybe he'd gone to relieve himself in the trees. Nothing. We searched a 50-yard radius around the machine. Standard protocol for this kind of situation, you assume the worker is injured somewhere close by. But we found nothing. No blood. No signs of struggle. No tracks leading away from the machine except the ones we'd made coming in. What I haven't told anyone outside the investigation is what we found next. I reported it at the time, but the reports were classified under an internal review that never went anywhere. About 30 yards from the excavator, Ellis spotted something on a stump. It was a pair of work boots, logger boots, the expensive kind with the steel toe and the high ankle support. They were placed there deliberately, side by side, laces still tied, not kicked off, not thrown, placed. I've worked in the Pacific Northwest forests my entire adult life, and I've seen my share of accidents. I've seen people crushed by equipment, killed by falling timber, lost to the terrain. But I've never seen someone vanish from a running machine with their lunch still warm and their boots arranged 100 feet away like some kind of calling card. We shut down the excavator and called in a full search and rescue operation. Over the next 4 days, we had 30 people combing that area. We brought in dogs. We brought in a helicopter with thermal imaging. We searched every ravine, every hollow, every possible place a person could fall or be trapped. The dogs picked up a scent trail that led from the excavator to the stump where we found the boots. And then nothing. It just stopped. The handler told me he'd never seen anything like it. Like the trail just ended in midair. The company that owned the equipment claimed they'd never authorized work in that section. When we traced the excavator's registration, it belonged to a contractor based out of Port Angeles. But when we contacted them, they said the machine had been reported stolen 3 weeks earlier. They'd filed a police report and everything. So we had a stolen excavator, an operator who didn't officially exist, and a pair of boots that, forensics confirmed, had been worn recently, still had sock lint in them, still had the sweat stains and wear patterns of regular use. Here's where it gets worse. After the search was called off, I started going through old records back at the office. I couldn't let it go. I started looking at incident reports from Section 12, going back to when it was first opened for logging in the early 70s. There were 3 other disappearances in that exact area. One in 1973, another in 1981, and the one in 1985 that wasn't technically a disappearance because they found remains, but the circumstances were strange enough that the case file was flagged. Every single incident followed a similar pattern. Equipment found running or recently shut off, operator missing, personal effects left behind in ways that didn't make sense. In the 1973 case, they found a chainsaw on the ground, still idling, next to a tree that was halfway cut through. The operator's jacket was folded neatly on a nearby log. They never found him. In 1981, it was a skidder operator who vanished mid-shift. His crew said he was there one moment, and when they looked back 5 minutes later, he was gone. They found his hard hat hanging from a tree branch, about 40 yards from his machine, placed there deliberately at a height that would have required a ladder to reach. The 1985 case was the one that got the area shut down. 2 workers were killed in what was officially ruled a slope failure, but the senior investigator noted inconsistencies in his report. The bodies were found at the bottom of a ravine, but the positioning didn't match a fall. They were laid out parallel to each other, boots removed and placed at their feet. The investigator wrote that it looked arranged but couldn't determine by whom or why. I made copies of all these reports. I probably wasn't supposed to, but I did anyway. I started noticing patterns that nobody had connected because the incidents were spread out over decades and handled by different personnel. Every disappearance happened in October. Every one happened on a Tuesday. Every one happened between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, and every single one involved footwear being removed and placed somewhere deliberate. I took my findings to my supervisor. He listened, reviewed the files, and then told me to drop it. Not in a threatening way, but in that bureaucratic tone that means the decision's already been made above your pay grade. He said the area was already restricted. There was no ongoing danger to workers, and digging up old cases would just create problems with the families and open the agency up to lawsuits. He suggested I take some personal time, said I seemed stressed from the search operation, but I couldn't drop it. I started talking to old-timers, retired rangers, and loggers who'd worked the Olympic Peninsula for decades. Most of them wouldn't say much, but there was one guy, retired faller named Otto who'd worked in the area in the 70s. He met me at a diner in Forks and told me things he said he'd never told anyone official. He said the old tribal loggers used to refuse to work Section 12. They called it something in their language that translated roughly to where the trees take back. They said there was something in that section of forest that didn't want to be cut, and every so often it would take someone as a reminder. Otto said he'd been part of the crew in 1973 when the first guy disappeared. He said they'd all heard something that day right before the man vanished. A sound like wind moving through the trees, except there was no wind. The trees themselves seemed to be swaying, but nothing else was moving. He said it scared him so badly that he refused to work that section ever again, took a transfer to a different district rather than go back. I asked him about the boots. Why the boots specifically? He looked at me for a long time before he answered. He said in the old stories, the ones the tribal elders used to tell, when the forest took someone, it would leave their shoes behind so the person couldn't walk back. So they'd stay in the forest forever. I stopped sleeping well after that conversation. I'd lie awake thinking about that operator, whoever he was. Thinking about him stepping out of that cab for some reason. Maybe hearing something, maybe seeing something. Taking off his boots or having them taken off. Walking into the forest in his socks and never coming back. The official report listed it as an abandoned stolen vehicle with no evidence of foul play. The case was closed within 6 months. No body was ever recovered. No operator was ever identified. The excavator was returned to the company, and Section 12 remained restricted. I worked another 8 years for the Forest Service, but I never went back to Section 12. I made sure of it. Whenever there were assignments in that area, I'd trade with someone or claim I had other obligations. Ellis left the Forest Service in 1999. Never gave a clear reason, but I always wondered if that day stayed with him the way it stayed with me. When I finally retired, I moved inland, away from the heavy timber. My wife thought it was because I wanted a change of scenery. Really, I just couldn't stand being near those forests anymore, knowing what I knew. Knowing that there are places in the Pacific Northwest where the old rules still apply, where something other than people and animals makes the decisions about who stays and who goes. I still have those copied reports in a box in my garage. Every October, I think about that operator. I think about his boots sitting on that stump, laces tied, perfectly placed. I think about him walking away from his warm coffee and his half-eaten sandwich, walking into the trees without his boots. I think about the others who went before him, and I wonder if there will be others after. The Forest Service will tell you that Section 12 is restricted because of geological instability. That's true, as far as it goes, but it's not the whole truth. Some places shouldn't be disturbed. Some places in these old-growth forests have their own way of maintaining the balance, and sometimes they'll take someone to make sure everyone else remembers that. I'm telling this story now because I'm far enough away and retired long enough that it doesn't matter anymore. But if you ever work in the timber industry in the Pacific Northwest, and someone tells you about a section of forest that's restricted for reasons that don't quite add up, pay attention. And if you ever find yourself in the deep woods and you hear that sound, that wind in the trees when there's no wind anywhere else, turn around, walk away, and whatever you do, keep your boots on. My name is Rachel, and I'm 34 years old. I've been selling real estate in the Willamette Valley for 11 years now, mostly around Sweet Home and the surrounding Lynn County area. I've shown foreclosures, short sales, properties with foundation issues, homes where people died, even one place that had been used as a meth lab. In this business, you learn to keep your professional smile on no matter what you walk into. You learn to see past the problems and focus on the potential. But there's one property I showed back in March of 2019 that I still can't rationalize away, no matter how hard I try. The listing came through as a bank-owned foreclosure on the edge of Sweet Home, about 3 miles out on Old Holly Road. It was a farmhouse originally built in the early 1900s, sitting on 12 acres of overgrown pasture land. The property had been through multiple owners over the decades, and the most recent one had defaulted on their mortgage 2 years earlier. The bank had sat on it for a while, probably trying to figure out what to do with a property that needed so much work. The asking price was absurdly low, even for a fixer-upper, which should have been my first warning sign. I had a young couple interested in looking at it. First-time buyers, late 20s, the kind of people who watch too many home renovation shows and think they can turn anything around with enough elbow grease and YouTube tutorials. I scheduled the showing for a Tuesday afternoon. The lockbox code worked fine, and we walked in through the front door into what you'd expect from a farmhouse that had been sitting empty for 2 years. Dust everywhere, water damage on some of the ceilings, that musty smell of a house that hasn't had its windows opened in too long. The couple walked through the main floor while I gave them my standard speech about looking past the cosmetic issues and seeing the bones of the place. Original hardwood floors, solid construction, good lot size. The husband was already doing mental calculations about renovation costs. The wife was less convinced, wrinkling her nose at the smell and the peeling wallpaper in the kitchen. I figured this would be a quick showing. They'd say thanks but no thanks, and we'd move on to the next property on our list. Then I noticed the door. It was in the kitchen, painted over so many times that it almost blended into the wall. I'd been in this house for maybe 15 minutes, and I'd walked past it 3 times without really seeing it. But once I noticed it, I couldn't understand how I'd missed it. It was there, obvious, a door in the corner of the kitchen that didn't match any of the others in the house. Professional curiosity made me try the handle. It was unlocked, which surprised me. Usually, bank-owned properties have everything secured or at least checked during the initial walkthrough. The door opened onto a set of wooden stairs leading down into darkness. I called out to the couple that there was a basement, which hadn't been mentioned anywhere in the listing documents. That should have been my second warning sign. In Sweet Home, especially in farmhouses from this era, basements are unusual. Most homes here were built with crawl spaces because of the high water table in the Willamette Valley. But here was a full basement, and it wasn't on any of the disclosure forms I'd received from the bank. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The couple followed me down the stairs, the husband excited about potential extra storage space, the wife still skeptical but willing to look. The stairs were steep and narrow, the kind that would never pass code in a modern build. At the bottom, I found a light switch, and when I flipped it, I was surprised that it actually worked. What I saw in that moment made me stop breathing for a solid 5 seconds. The basement wasn't large, maybe 20 feet by 15 feet, with a low ceiling that would make anyone over 6 feet tall have to duck. But that's not what made me freeze. Every single surface of that room, from floor to ceiling, was covered in children's drawings. Not wallpapered, not decorated, covered. Hundreds of drawings, maybe thousands, layered over each other in some places, creating this dense collage of crayon and marker and pencil on every available inch of concrete and drywall. The wife made a small noise behind me, something between surprise and discomfort. The husband said something about the previous owners having kids, trying to rationalize what we were seeing. But I was already looking closer, and what I saw made my professional composure start to crack. Every single drawing, despite being done in different styles, and clearly by different hands with varying skill levels, depicted the same thing. A figure, tall, impossibly tall, with a body that was too thin and too long, and no face. Not a blank face, not a covered face, but no face at all, just a smooth expanse where features should have been. Some drawings were crude, clearly done by very young children, just stick figures with that elongated faceless form looming over them. Others were more detailed, showing the figure standing in doorways, standing beside beds, standing in the corner of rooms. The more detailed ones were worse because you could see that the children who drew them had really tried to capture what they were seeing. The proportions of the rooms were careful. The furniture was recognizable, and in every single one, that same faceless figure, always watching. The wife backed toward the stairs. She said she wanted to leave. The husband was still trying to make sense of it, suggesting that maybe it was some kind of art project. Maybe the kids were into scary stories. But his voice had lost its earlier enthusiasm. I should have listened to the wife. I should have led them back upstairs right then, marked the property as not suitable, and moved on. Instead, I did what I'd been trained to do. I started looking for the disclosure, implications. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. If there was going to be an issue with the property, I needed documentation. That's when I noticed the dates. Some of the drawings had dates on them, written in children's handwriting at the bottom or in the corner. 1974, 1975, 1976, 1977. The dates continued through to 1979, and then they stopped. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I've been doing this job long enough to know that when you're selling a property, you need to disclose certain things. Deaths on the property, structural issues, anything that might affect the buyer's decision. But I had no disclosure forms mentioning anything unusual about this house's history. Nothing about why there would be a hidden basement covered in disturbing drawings from the 1970s. The couple left. They were polite about it, said they'd think about it, but I knew I'd never hear from them again. I should have left too. I should have locked up and gone back to my office and called the bank to ask what the hell I was supposed to do with this listing. But instead, I stayed. I stood in that basement for another 20 minutes, looking at those drawings, trying to understand what I was seeing. There were details I hadn't noticed at first. Some of the drawings had words written on them. He watches. He comes at night. Don't sleep. He's always here. The handwriting varied, different children, different ages. But the message was consistent. Whatever they were drawing, they believed it was real. They believed it was there with them. When I finally left, I locked up the house and drove straight to the county records office. I needed to know the history of this property. I needed to know who had lived there, who those children were, and why none of this had been disclosed to me. The records clerk was helpful, pulled up everything they had on the property going back to its construction in 1908. The property had changed hands several times over the decades. Nothing unusual there. But when I got to the records from the 1970s, I found something that made me sit down in the research room and stare at the documents for a long time. From 1972 to 1980, the property was owned by a man whose name I won't repeat here. According to tax records and census data that the clerk helped me access, that man lived alone, single occupant, no dependents claimed, no family listed. But utilities records showed water and electricity usage consistent with a much larger household. Someone had been living there, lots of someones, but they weren't documented anywhere official. I started digging deeper, going through old Sweet Home newspaper archives that the county had digitized. In 1980, there was a small article about the property being sold after the owner's death. The article mentioned that neighbors had reported seeing children on the property over the years, but when authorities investigated after the owner died, the house was empty. No children were found. No records of any children having lived there existed. The article treated it as a local mystery, the kind of small-town oddity that gets mentioned once and then forgotten. But I found something else. In the newspaper archives from 1979, there were several missing children reports from the Pacific Northwest region. Not from Sweet Home specifically, but from towns within a 100-mile radius. Eugene, Salem, Albany, Lebanon. Children who disappeared and were never found. 8 of them in total over a 2-year period. The cases went cold. No bodies were ever recovered. No suspects were ever charged. I cross-referenced the dates on those missing children reports with the dates I'd seen on the drawings in the basement. They matched. Not perfectly, but close enough to make my hands shake as I wrote down the information. A child disappeared in Salem in March 1974. There were drawings dated April 1974. Another child went missing from Lebanon in October 1975. Drawings dated November 1975. I should have gone to the police right then. I should have reported what I'd found. But I was thinking like a real estate agent, not like a citizen with a civic duty. I was thinking about liability, about disclosure requirements, about whether I could be held responsible for selling a property where something terrible had clearly happened. I was thinking about my reputation, my career, my agency's exposure. So instead, I went back to my office and I called the bank that owned the property. I told them I needed to speak with someone about disclosure issues on the old Holly Road listing. They transferred me 3 times before I got someone in their asset management department. I explained what I'd found in the basement. I told them about the drawings, about the county records showing utility usage that didn't match the official occupancy, about the newspaper articles. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then the person I was speaking with, a woman whose name I don't remember, told me that the property was being pulled from the market. She said it needed further evaluation before it could be listed again. She thanked me for my diligence and said someone would be in touch about my commission on future sales. Then she hung up. That was 4 years ago. The property is still owned by the bank. It's never been relisted. The for sale sign was taken down within a week of that phone call, and as far as I know, no one has been inside since. I drive past it sometimes when I'm showing other properties in that area. The house is still standing, slowly deteriorating, windows dark, grass overgrown. There's a new chain across the driveway with a no trespassing sign. I've thought about those drawings every day since. I've thought about the children who made them, wherever they are now, if they're still alive. I've thought about what they saw in that house, what made them draw the same faceless figure over and over again. I've thought about the county records showing 23 people worth of utility usage in a house where only one person officially lived. Last year, I was showing a different property to a client, and we got to talking about local history. He was a long-time Sweet Home resident in his 70s, and he remembered the farmhouse on Old Holly Road. He said that in the late 70s, before he really knew what was happening, there had been rumors about that place. People said they'd see children in the windows at night, but during the day, the property always looked abandoned, except for the owner's truck in the driveway. He said one time he drove past and counted 6 different children's faces in the upstairs windows, but when he mentioned it to the sheriff's department, they told him the owner had been checked out multiple times and everything was fine. I wanted to ask him more, but my professional training kicked in. I changed the subject, showed him the property he'd come to see, and maintained my composure. But that night, I looked up those missing children cases again. I found photos of some of them, scanned newspaper clippings from the Pacific Northwest archives. 8 children, ages ranging from 6 to 12. All disappeared between 1974 and 1979, all from within 100 miles of Sweet Home. I've never told anyone this full story before. My broker knows there was a disclosure issue with the property, but not the details. The bank never contacted me again after that phone call. The listing disappeared from the MLS like it never existed. I still have the photos I took that day in the basement, stored on my phone in a folder I can't bring myself to delete, but also can't bear to look at. Sometimes I wonder if I should have done more, if I should have pushed harder, called the police, demanded an investigation. But I know how these things work in the real estate business. You learn to handle problems quietly, to protect the sale, to maintain professional relationships with the banks and the agencies. You learn that some properties have histories that are better left undisclosed, problems that are easier to ignore than to confront. I still sell real estate in the Willamette Valley. I still show foreclosures and problem properties. I still maintain my professional smile and help clients see the potential in places that need work. But I've never forgotten that basement, those drawings, those faceless figures that dozens of children saw clearly enough to render in crayon and marker over and over again. If you're looking at real estate in the Pacific Northwest, especially older properties with complicated histories, ask questions. Ask about previous owners. Ask about utility records that don't match occupancy. Ask if there are any parts of the house that aren't included in the official floor plan. And if your agent seems nervous about answering, if they change the subject or suggest moving on to a different property, pay attention to that. Sometimes the houses we can't sell have very good reasons for staying empty. My name is Martin, and I'm 29 years old. I've been driving long haul for almost a decade now, running routes up and down the Pacific Northwest, through Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. I spend more time on the road than I do in my own apartment. I know highways the way most people know the layouts of their houses. I know which rest areas have clean bathrooms, which truck stops have decent coffee, which sections of road have state police hiding in the shadows. I know the CB frequencies, the trucker lingo, the unwritten rules of the road, but nothing in my years of driving prepared me for what I witnessed on Highway 75 in central Idaho, and nothing has prepared me for living with what I did about it afterward. It was March 3rd of 2017. I was heading north from Boise on Highway 75, heading towards Stanley and then eventually up into Montana. I'd left Boise around 11 that morning, and I was making good time. The route takes you through some beautiful country, up into the Sawtooth Mountains, but that day I was mostly focused on schedule and fuel consumption. I had a delivery in Missoula that needed to be there by morning, and I was running a little behind. Around 2:50 in the morning, I was fighting fatigue hard. I'd been driving for nearly 15 hours straight, with only a 30-minute break for fuel around midnight. The road had been quiet for the last hour, barely any traffic at all. The stars were incredible that night, the kind of clarity you only get up in the mountains, away from city lights. But I was too tired to appreciate it. My eyes were getting heavy, and I knew I needed to stop. There's a rest area on Highway 75, south of Bellevue, that's been there for years. It's a small facility, just a parking area with bathrooms and a picnic area. Most truckers know about it because it's one of the few places to pull off that leg of the highway before you get way up into the mountains. I pulled in around 3 in the morning. The rest area was nearly empty. I saw one sedan parked near the far end, but I didn't pay much attention to it. I pulled my truck into one of the designated trucker parking spaces and shut down the engine. My plan was to walk around a little, splash some cold water on my face, maybe drink a strong coffee from my thermos to try to get my second wind. I was in the bathroom when I heard the sound. 2 truck engines starting up almost simultaneously. That was odd enough to register in my tired brain. It's unusual to have 2 trucks at a rest area at that hour. Most truckers are sleeping in their cabs at 3 in the morning. I finished up quickly and headed back outside. What I saw made me stop dead in my tracks. There was a truck I hadn't noticed before, a Peterbilt, parked on the opposite side of the lot from where I'd parked my rig. Its engine was running. The cab door was open, and there was a man standing beside the truck, and he was holding something. Or rather, he was holding someone. He had a young girl by the arm, and he was in the process of lifting her up into the truck's cab. I didn't immediately process what I was seeing. My brain was too tired to make sense of it. I just stood there for a moment, watching. The girl looked young, maybe 8 or 9 years old. She was struggling, trying to pull away from the man. The man was saying something to her, but I couldn't hear what from where I was standing. Then he practically shoved her into the cab and climbed in after her. At the same time, the driver of the sedan, the one I'd seen earlier, came jogging around from the direction of the bathrooms. He had something in his hand, looked like a sleeping bag or a blanket rolled up. He opened the passenger door of the first truck, threw the bundle into the cab, and climbed in after it. That's when it clicked for me. That's when I realized something was very wrong. I'd heard stories on the CB. You hear things when you spend enough time around other drivers. Stories about trafficking, about exploitation, about horrible things happening to vulnerable people on the roads. I'd never paid them much attention before, figured they were urban legends like most of the other BS people talk about on the radio. But watching this unfold in real time, I understood immediately what I was looking at. My instinct was to do something, to run over there, to yell, to try to stop what was happening. But the Pacific Northwest is vast and empty at 3 a.m, and I was one guy against 2 men who were clearly organized. The first truck started rolling, moving toward the exit of the rest area. I made a split-second decision. I ran to my cab, grabbed my phone, and called 911. The dispatcher was calm and professional. I gave her my location, told her I'd witnessed what I believed was a child abduction in progress at the rest area on Highway 75 south of Bellevue. I told her the description of the girl, what little I could remember. Age, approximate height, wearing what looked like a dark-colored dress. I told her about the 2 trucks. I gave her the license plate number of the sedan. But here's where things started to get strange. The dispatcher asked me to repeat the license plate number. I did. She said, "I'm going to put you on hold for just a moment." I waited. The 2 trucks pulled out of the rest area and headed north on Highway 75 toward the mountains. I watched them go, thinking about that girl, wondering if I should chase them, wondering if I could catch them even if I wanted to. When the dispatcher came back on the line, she said something that made my stomach drop. She said, "The license plate you provided doesn't match any registered vehicle in our system. Are you certain about the number?" I was certain. I'd watched the sedan for long enough. I'd gotten a good look at it. Idaho plates, I remembered that clearly. I gave her the number again. She said she'd need to send officers anyway, and someone would be out to the rest area to take my statement. She asked me to stay put. I was too agitated to stay in my cab. I paced the rest area, checking my phone every few seconds. It took about 20 minutes for the state police to show up. 2 officers pulled in, lights off, low profile. They seemed skeptical from the moment they walked up to me. I told them the whole story. They took notes, asked me to describe the trucks in detail. I did my best. A Peterbilt, I was pretty sure it was red or burgundy colored. The sedan was silver or gray, compact car. I wasn't sure of the make. The officers explained that they'd checked with dispatch and there was no vehicle registered with the license plate number I'd provided. They said it was possible I'd gotten the number wrong in the stress of the moment. They also said that without a confirmed sighting of actual criminal activity, there wasn't much they could do beyond filing a report and alerting the highway patrol to look for the vehicles. I felt the adrenaline draining out of me, replaced by a sick feeling in my stomach. I told them I knew what I'd seen. I told them about the girl, about how she was struggling, about the obvious coordination between the 2 men. The officers were polite but clearly unconvinced. They got my information, said they'd follow up if anything came of the report, and then they left. I drove north on Highway 75 that night, heading into the dark mountains, unable to stop thinking about that girl. I should have pulled over somewhere and called again. I should have driven north, looking for those trucks. I should have done something more aggressive, but I didn't. I drove. I got to my delivery in Missoula around 7 that morning, and I unloaded my cargo with my mind completely elsewhere. The next morning, I was having breakfast at a truck stop in Missoula when I saw the news on a television mounted in the corner of the diner. Missing girl from Boise, 8 years old, disappeared from her family's home on March 1st. They were asking for the public's help locating her. They showed a photo. It was Naomi. Same face, same dark hair, same girl I'd seen at the rest area on Highway 75. I called the Boise Police Department immediately. I told them I'd witnessed a girl matching the description at the rest area on Highway 75 early on March 3rd. I gave them my name, my number, everything. The officer I spoke with seemed interested, asked me detailed questions about what I'd seen. I felt a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, This information would help them find her. But nothing came of it. Days passed. I kept checking the news, kept watching for any updates. The search was focused on Boise, on the neighborhood where Naomi disappeared. There was no mention of any sightings on Highway 75. No mention of 2 trucks. No mention of any leads pointing toward trafficking or abduction on the road. I reached out again, called the Boise Police Department multiple times over the next week. Each time, I was transferred to different detectives, and each time I had to repeat my story. Eventually, I got the sense that they didn't believe me. One detective asked if I'd been under the influence at the time. Another suggested that maybe I'd misremembered the timing. A third implied that I might be confused about whether I'd really seen a child at all. I wasn't confused. I knew what I'd seen. But as days turned into weeks with no new information, the uncertainty started to creep in. Had I gotten the license plate number wrong? Had I misread the situation? Was it possible the girl I'd seen wasn't Naomi? I started second-guessing myself, which was exactly the wrong thing to do. In the months after that night, I tried to move on. I kept driving, kept running my routes. But I developed hypervigilance about other drivers and other situations on the road. I started documenting everything. If I saw something suspicious, I would take pictures, write down information, call it in. I'm talking obsessive documentation. Some of the other drivers I knew started asking if I was okay. They said I seemed wound up, stressed, not like my usual self. The truth was, I wasn't okay. I couldn't get Naomi out of my head. I would lie awake in motels, thinking about what might have happened to her after that night at the rest area. I would drive past the spot where I'd seen her, half hoping and half terrified that I might see those trucks again. In 2018, a year after the incident, there was a news story about a human trafficking ring that operated out of central Idaho. Federal agents had broken it up, arrested several people. The story didn't mention Naomi specifically, but it talked about other victims who'd been found. I read that story multiple times, looking for any reference to the girl I'd seen or the trucks I'd witnessed. There was nothing. No confirmation that what I'd seen had anything to do with the trafficking operation. What I did find, through some internet research, was that there were other missing girls from the region in that same time period. Not just Naomi. A girl from central Idaho, a girl from Montana. The timelines matched up with what would make sense if someone was moving victims along Highway 75 through the Pacific Northwest. But there was no official connection made between these cases as far as I could find. The thing that bothers me most is that license plate that didn't exist. That's what I keep coming back to. A police dispatcher checked it and said there was no vehicle registered with that number. How is that possible? I saw it clearly. Granted, I was tired, but I saw it clearly. The only explanation I can come up with is that the plate was fake, or it was registered to a different name, or there was something else going on that I didn't understand. I've been trying to piece it together for years now. I've contacted trucking advocacy groups, victim support organizations, even tried reaching out to some investigative journalists. Most people are sympathetic, but they all tell me the same thing. Without additional evidence or corroboration, there's not much anyone can do with a single sighting from a tired trucker at 3 a.m. But I know what I saw. I know that girl's face. I know her name was Naomi. And I know that somewhere out there, the people who have information about what happened to her are probably still operating, probably still moving through the Pacific Northwest, probably still on Highway 75 between Boise and the Idaho mountains. I still drive for a living. Every time I pass through that rest area south of Bellevue, I think about that night. Every time I see 2 trucks traveling together on Highway 75, I get that sick feeling in my stomach. I obsessively track missing children cases in the region. I have a folder on my phone filled with news articles and photos. Some people would call that unhealthy. I call it being responsible for what I witnessed and doing whatever I can to stay vigilant. The worst part is the helplessness. Knowing that something terrible happened. Knowing you might have been in a position to prevent it. and being unable to do anything because nobody believes you or nobody with the power to help can find the resources to act on your information. That helplessness stays with you. It changes how you see the world, how you trust institutions and authority. But I also have Aiden, my younger brother, who's 14 now. He's at that age where he could easily be a target if he ended up in the wrong situation. Naomi was 8. She was just a kid in a vulnerable moment. I think about what her family went through, what they're probably still going through. I think about my brother, about other kids like him, and I realize that my obsessive documentation might seem unhealthy to some people, but to me it's the only way I can cope with the knowledge that I was there and I couldn't do enough. If you drive the roads in central Idaho or anywhere through the Pacific Northwest and you see something that seems off, something that makes your instinct scream that something is wrong, trust that instinct. Call it in. Call 911. Call the local police. Call the FBI. And keep calling until someone listens. Because there are people operating in those mountains and on those highways who are preying on the vulnerable, and every piece of information might be the one that makes the difference. My name is Laney, and I'm 41 years old. I work as a freelance audio archivist, which is a fancy way of saying I digitize old recordings and organize them for libraries, universities, and various historical societies. It's meticulous work, the kind of job that requires patience, attention to detail, and an ability to sit alone with headphones for 8 to 10 hours a day. I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've digitized everything from family oral histories to corporate boardroom recordings to jazz club recordings from the 1950s. Most of it is mundane. Some of it is fascinating, but I've never encountered anything like what I found in those fire lookout tower recordings from Cascade, Idaho. The project came to me through a university in Boise. The Idaho State Historical Society had acquired a collection of Forest Service materials from the 1970s and 1980s, including a box of reel-to-reel recordings from a fire lookout tower that had been in operation in the remote mountains between Cascade and the Sawtooth National Forest. The recordings had been deteriorating for decades, stored improperly in someone's garage, exposed to temperature fluctuations and humidity that were destroying the magnetic tape. The university wanted them digitized before they became completely unlistenable. I made the arrangements to work on site at the university's facility. This is standard for archival work with irreplaceable materials. You don't move delicate historical recordings unless absolutely necessary. I spent 2 weeks that summer in Boise, working in their climate-controlled archive room, carefully transferring the tapes to digital format, using specialized equipment designed for audio preservation and restoration. The recordings were dated from 1982 to 1984, which placed them during the era when many of the Pacific Northwest's older fire lookout towers were transitioning from staffed positions to automated systems. Some towers kept human operators, others relied on electronic sensors. According to the documentation that came with the recordings, the Cascade Tower had been staffed during the entire period covered by these tapes. The preservation metadata indicated the tapes had been stored in Forest Service archives until budget cuts led to their transfer to the Historical Society. I worked methodically through the collection using standard archival procedures. Most of the recordings were brief: weather reports, fire observations, standard operational notes. Lookout tower operators would record brief updates several times a day. The content was predictable and consistent with fire management protocols from that era. Clear skies, light wind from the west, no smoke observed, tower temperature 87 degrees. That kind of thing. It was background noise, the mundane documentation of a routine job. My digitization process included tagging metadata, noting audio quality issues, and cross-referencing each tape with available documentation. But as I got deeper into the collection, I started noticing something odd. There were longer recordings, personal observations that went beyond the standard operational log. These came from the 1983 season, specifically from July and August. The operator's voice sounded stressed. Not alarmed exactly, but definitely tense. He was speaking carefully, like someone being very deliberate about explaining something complex. I began flagging these recordings for closer analysis. His name was Bodie, according to the documentation. Bodie was the tower operator that summer. I started making detailed notes about his recordings, documenting the timestamps and the general content in my archival database. By the end of the first week, I had identified about 20 minutes of material that seemed notably different from the standard operational log. The quality of the recordings varied. Some were clear and well captured. Others had background noise and atmospheric interference that required digital enhancement. I asked the university archivist if there was any additional documentation about Bodie, about his tenure at the Cascade Tower, about whether anything unusual had happened that summer. She pulled files and cross-referenced with the Forest Service records using their database systems. What she found was interesting. Bodie had worked at the Cascade Tower from 1982 to 1985. He'd then transferred to a different tower for a year, and then he'd left the Forest Service entirely. No explanation in the file. No note about his departure. No performance reviews to explain the transfer. She also found something else. According to Forest Service records, the Cascade Tower was listed as automated during the 1983 season, but the recordings I was digitizing were clearly made by a human operator. The acoustic characteristics were distinctive, the ambient sounds of a lived-in space, the personal inflections in Bodie's voice, the way he varied his recording protocols from day to day. So either the records were wrong or something didn't add up. This kind of discrepancy was worth investigating through the archival process. I asked the archivist if we could cross-reference with other documentation from 1983. We found work orders, equipment logs, fire incident reports. All of them referenced the tower being in use, with someone maintaining it. But the official staffing records said it should have been automated. The inconsistency was significant enough that it warranted further research into the historical records. This kind of discrepancy isn't totally unusual in archival work. Old records are incomplete, sometimes contradictory. Institutions lose documentation, misfile materials, or maintain inaccurate databases. But it made me curious about what Bodie was saying in those longer recordings. I decided to listen to them more carefully using enhanced audio processing to improve clarity. The first one I listened to in detail was from July 18, 1983. Bodie was describing what he'd observed from the tower. He was talking about the forest around the tower, about the Sawtooth Mountains that surrounded him, about the way the landscape looked in the heat of the afternoon. His observations were technical at first. Tree species, fire danger ratings, weather patterns relative to seasonal norms. But then his voice changed. It became more careful, more measured. His speech patterns shifted, indicating emotional strain. "I've been noticing something," he said into the recorder. "There's movement in the forest, not animals. Something else, something that moves wrong." He elaborated with specificity. He'd been watching the tree line from the tower, looking down at the forest floor and the lower canopy for signs of fire danger. He'd noticed movement in the trees, but it wasn't the movement of animals he was familiar with. It was bipedal, he noted, upright movement, but the gait was strange. The documentation I was creating included timestamps for all significant portions of the recordings. "The way it moves through the trees," Bodie said, "is like nothing I've ever seen. It's like the joints work differently, like the legs bend at angles that don't make sense. There's a kind of fluidity to it, but also something fundamentally wrong about the proportions. I've been watching this for about a week now, and I keep seeing the same kind of movement. I don't know if it's a single entity or multiple entities. The behavior is consistent, though. It moves at night, mostly, but I've seen it during the day as well. I made detailed notes of this in my archival database. It was unusual content for a fire lookout recording, but lookout towers can be isolating places. People talk to themselves. They document their psychological states as well as meteorological observations. Isolation syndrome and the psychological effects of remote work were well documented in occupational research. I continued listening, maintaining my objective, analytical approach. Over the following recordings from July and August, Bodhi documented increasingly frequent observations of these shapes moving through the forest. He was clinical in his descriptions, maintaining the tone of someone documenting phenomena he didn't understand, but was trying to observe objectively. This clinical approach actually made the content more unsettling. He wasn't sensationalizing, he was simply reporting. "I've counted at least 4 distinct shapes," he said in one recording from July 25th. "They move through the deep forest. I can track them by the movement of branches and undergrowth, but I can rarely see them clearly. When I do see them through the scope, the detail is limited, but the proportions are consistent. Elongated limbs. That strange gait. They don't follow normal trails. They move through the densest parts of the forest. One of them came to within approximately 200 yards of the tower last night. I watched it for nearly 30 minutes through the observation scope. I was becoming fascinated by this, but also unsettled. The Pacific Northwest has a rich history of folklore and cryptid stories. Sasquatch, other unexplained entities. Bodhi's descriptions could have been someone spinning a mystery, or it could have been someone experiencing genuine psychological distress in an isolated environment. I couldn't determine which, and that ambiguity was part of what made it compelling to listen to. I was documenting everything carefully, preserving the audio in multiple formats to ensure no information was lost. But then I found the final recording. It was dated August 19th, 1983. The timestamp indicated it was the last recording on the tape. The preservation metadata suggested this tape had been stored in increasingly poor conditions, which may have been why the final recording was corrupted or truncated. The recording started normally enough. Bodhi was describing weather conditions with the precision of someone trained in meteorological observation. Temperature, wind speed, humidity, standard operational log. He noted no fires observed, clear visibility, normal conditions for late August. But then his voice changed again. The tone shifted from routine reporting to something more immediate and personal. "I've gotten a closer look," he said. "One of them came very close to the tower today. I don't know why. I don't know if it was curious, or if it was checking on me, or if I'm reading intent into something that's purely random animal behavior. But it came close enough that I could see it clearly through the window. I've documented this on the 8mm film camera like I documented the others. The footage is in the storage locker." He paused. There was a sound in the background that I couldn't immediately identify. Like wind, maybe, or machinery. I ran the audio through signal processing software to isolate and analyze the background noise, but the results were inconclusive. "It's not an animal," Bodhi continued. His voice had taken on a quality I can only describe as strained. "I'm certain of that now. I don't know what it is. It's humanoid but not human. The proportions are all wrong. The height is extreme. The way the joints work is not how human anatomy works. The head is—" The recording cut off mid-sentence. Not like it was edited. Not like there was a deliberate fade. Like the tape had simply stopped while he was still speaking. The waveform in my digitization software showed the audio stopping abruptly, with no gradual reduction in amplitude. It was a sudden cessation, as though the recording equipment had been shut off or had malfunctioned. I listened to that final section multiple times. I enhanced the audio, tried to extract any additional information from the background noise using spectral analysis and acoustic processing. But the recording genuinely seemed to have just stopped. There was no fade out, No indication that Bodhi had stopped speaking voluntarily. It just ended. The digital analysis suggested the tape itself may have broken or slipped from the recording mechanism. I reported my findings to the university archivist. I explained the discrepancy between the official staffing records and what the recording showed. I also explained what Bodhi had documented, maintaining my archival objectivity throughout the explanation. The archivist seemed interested but not particularly alarmed. She suggested that the recordings were likely the product of someone experiencing isolation-induced psychological phenomena, which is well documented in occupational health research and not uncommon in remote work environments. But she also agreed that the staffing record discrepancy was worth investigating further through official channels. She contacted the Forest Service Archive office in Portland to ask about the Cascade Tower records from 1983. She asked specifically if there was any documentation about whether Bodhi had reported unusual activity or if there had been any incidents at the tower that summer. She also inquired about the 8mm film camera footage that Bodhi had mentioned in his final recording. The response she received was strange. The Forest Service stated that according to their records, the Cascade Tower had been fully automated during 1983, and that there was no Bodhi on staff that year. They suggested that the recordings might be from a different location or a different year. They also stated that they had no documentation of 8mm film footage from the tower. They recommended the university verify the provenance of the materials before drawing any conclusions. But the recordings were clearly dated, and the documentation in the collection explicitly identified them as coming from the Cascade Tower. The chain of custody records traced the materials back through multiple institutional transfers. I spent another week trying to verify information. I was able to find a Bodhi in the Forest Service database who had been assigned to the Cascade Tower from 1982 to 1985. But when I tried to access more detailed records about his employment, I encountered barriers. The file was flagged as restricted. I couldn't access his performance reviews, his termination documentation, or any notes about his departure from the service. The restriction notice was vague and offered no explanation. The university archivist tried to make a formal request through the Forest Service Information Office. The response was that those records were personnel files and therefore protected by federal privacy regulations. The Forest Service couldn't release them without Bodhi's consent, which they had no way of obtaining because they couldn't locate him. The response was polite but final. So we have recordings from a fire lookout tower dated 1983, documenting strange observations about shapes moving through the forest near Cascade, Idaho. The recordings end mid-sentence on the final tape. The official Forest Service records claim the tower was automated that year. The official staffing records have been flagged as restricted in the database. The operator has disappeared from accessible records, and I can't find any documentation about what happened to him or where he went after 1985. The reference to 8mm film footage in a storage locker has no corroborating evidence in the archival record. I've been researching this for 3 years now. I've digitized the recordings and archived them through proper channels. But I've also made copies for my own research and analysis. I've spent countless hours listening to Bodhi's voice, trying to understand what he was documenting. I've looked into the history of the Cascade area through historical databases and geographic surveys, read accounts of hikers and rangers who've worked in that region, tried to find any corroboration of unusual activity in the forests around the Sawtooth Mountains. What I've found is mostly silence. A few anecdotal accounts from hikers about strange shapes in the deep forest, documented in informal online forums and hiking community archives. One ranger's personal blog, where he mentioned hearing sounds he couldn't identify. A brief mention in a 1984 regional newspaper about unusual animal activity in the Sawtooth region that wildlife officials couldn't explain, but nothing definitive. Nothing that confirms what Bodie was documenting with certainty. But I also haven't found anything that definitively contradicts it. And I've found enough discrepancies in the official records to make me suspect that something happened at the Cascade Tower in 1983 that the Forest Service has decided not to document officially. The discrepancies between the staffing records and the actual recordings suggest deliberate omission. The flagging of Bodie's personnel file suggests something worth protecting. The missing 8mm film footage raises questions about what visual documentation may have been collected. I've become somewhat obsessed with this. I know people think I'm crazy. My colleagues have suggested that I'm reading too much into archival anomalies, that I'm constructing narratives out of incomplete information. But that's exactly what archivists do. We piece together fragments of history and try to understand the whole picture. We work with incomplete records and try to fill in gaps through contextual analysis. And the picture I'm constructing from these materials points to someone documenting real observations from a remote location in the Pacific Northwest. Observations that were considered significant enough to suppress at an institutional level. I still have the digitized recordings on my computer, stored in multiple backup formats. I've thought about releasing them publicly, making them available to researchers and enthusiasts interested in unexplained phenomena and archival mysteries, but I'm held back by professional ethics. These are archival materials. I'm bound by protocols about how historical recordings should be handled. I'm also bound by the restrictions placed on the materials by the Forest Service through the university's acquisition agreement. But I'm also bound by my own curiosity, and by the sense that Bodie was trying to tell us something important before that final tape cut off mid-sentence. If you ever find yourself at a fire lookout tower, especially in the Pacific Northwest, especially in the remote mountains around Cascade, Idaho, pay attention to what you observe. Document it carefully, preserve it in multiple formats, and consider that there might be reasons why official records sometimes don't match reality. Sometimes that discrepancy is worth investigating. My name is Jorge, and I'm 67 years old now. I spent nearly 45 years as a commercial fisherman out of Tokeland, Washington, running nets in Willapa Bay and the adjacent Pacific waters. Tokeland is one of those towns that exists because of the ocean. It's not much to look at, just a working port community built on the assumption that people will keep fishing and the fish will keep coming. I spent most of my adult life on the water, watching seasons change, watching the salmon runs fluctuate with the Pacific currents and temperature shifts, watching the fishing community get smaller year after year as regulations tightened and corporate operations pushed out the independent operators like me. I retired in 2007, mostly because my back couldn't handle the physical demands anymore, but also because fishing had stopped feeling like the profession I'd loved. It had become something harder to reconcile with, something that required looking the other way sometimes. But there was one incident from 1991, during what should have been a routine salmon run, that taught me exactly why the fishing community has always operated under a certain code. You don't ask too many questions, you do your job. And when something comes up that doesn't make sense, you keep your mouth shut unless you want serious trouble. It was late September of 1991. The chum salmon run was in full swing, which meant the bay was crowded with commercial vessels trying to fill their quota before the season closed. I was running a 50-foot gill netter that I'd owned for about 12 years at that point. She was a good boat, well-maintained, reliable. I had a crew of 2 that year, experienced fishermen who knew the water and knew how to work drift nets efficiently. Angelo and Remington were their names, both guys I'd worked with for years. We understood each other's rhythms, didn't need much verbal communication to operate as a unit in the confined space of a working vessel. The weather had been stable that week, which meant good fishing conditions throughout the Willapa Bay system. We'd been working the deeper channels, running drift nets that we'd check every 45 minutes or so, according to state regulations. The technique is straightforward if you understand the mechanics. You set the net in the channel where the salmon are running. You let it soak for a controlled period, and then you haul it back in and process whatever you've caught. We'd been getting good catches, respectable numbers of chum salmon, decent size, which meant better price at the fish house when we brought our catch in for landing tickets. On the morning of September 24th, we were working a channel about 2 miles south of Tokeland, an area we'd fished many times. The water was dark that morning, the tide was running strong, and the sky was overcast in that way that forecast the approach of Pacific Northwest autumn weather. Good fishing weather. We'd set the net around 6 in the morning, and were planning to haul it in around 6:45. That's an industry standard soak time in that area, balanced to get good catch without damaging the salmon or catching too much incidental bycatch of non-target species. When we started hauling in the net, something felt different immediately. The weight on the line was wrong. A net full of salmon has a specific feel. You can tell by the resistance and the movement whether you've got a good catch or if something unusual is happening. This weight was different. It was heavier than it should have been for the amount of resistance we were getting, and the net seemed to be catching on something as it came through the water. Angelo and Remington were working the net roller while I monitored the hauling mechanism from the winch. As the net came up, we started seeing the problem. Mixed in with the salmon were objects that definitely weren't fish. At first, I thought they might be rocks or debris that had gotten tangled in the mesh, the kind of thing that happens when you're working bay waters, where there's a lot of historical sediment and occasional underwater obstruction. But as we got more of the net hauled aboard, it became clear that what we'd caught was something else entirely. Wedding rings, dozens of them, tangled throughout the mesh of the net along with the salmon. Small ones, large ones, simple bands, ornate settings with stones. Some with obvious wear patterns, indicating they'd been worn for years. Some looking newer, with less oxidation and discoloration. All of them tangled into the Pacific Northwest fishing nets in ways that made no practical sense whatsoever. I remember Angelo calling out, "Captain, what the hell is this?" He was holding up a ring, examining it in the morning light. I told him to set everything aside and keep hauling. I was thinking through scenarios. Trash from a shipwreck, maybe, or from a maritime accident. But wedding rings specifically, in such quantity, seemed unlikely to end up in a random distribution across 20-fathom water unless something very deliberate had happened to bring them there. By the time we had the net fully aboard, we'd recovered 47 wedding rings. They were scattered throughout the mesh in ways that suggested they'd been there for a long time. The saltwater corrosion on them varied significantly. Some were heavily oxidized, their once bright surfaces now dull and pitted. Others were less corroded, the deterioration less advanced, suggesting they'd entered the water at different times. Many of them had inscriptions on the inside, dates, initials, messages. Some of them were inscribed with dates going back decades into the mid-20th century. I found one that said, James and Eleanor, 1957. Another said, Forever Yours, 1962. I held them in my hands and looked at my crew, and nobody said anything for a long time. We all understood what this probably meant, even though none of us wanted to articulate it. We were experienced enough in the Pacific Northwest to know that the bay had depths and mysteries that weren't meant to be explored too thoroughly. Remington suggested we should call the police. Angelo was more pragmatic. He said calling authorities was going to mean paperwork and questions and investigations, which would mean we'd lose fishing time, which would mean we'd lose money. He suggested we just dump them back overboard and forget about it. That's how fishing communities work. When something doesn't add up, and the truth is going to be uncomfortable, you have the option to walk away and not look back. You can let the ocean keep its secrets. But I had this idea that maybe these belonged to families. Maybe there was a disappearance, a boating accident, something that had left families wondering. Maybe these rings mattered, So I made the decision to bring them in, to report them to the authorities, and to let them figure out what had happened. I genuinely thought I was doing the right thing at the time. I radioed the Coast Guard station in Westport and reported what we'd found. They told us to proceed to the nearest dock and wait for them to collect the materials. We headed back to Tokeland, and by the time we arrived, there was already a county sheriff waiting for us at the dock. Not the Coast Guard, a county sheriff. That struck me as odd, but I didn't think too much about it at the time. I thought maybe they'd coordinated and the sheriff was there to provide local law enforcement support. The sheriff's name was Henderson. I remember him clearly because he seemed to take the matter very seriously in a way that made me immediately uncomfortable. He examined the rings carefully, cross-checked the names and dates against some sort of database on a laptop he had in his vehicle. He made notes in a small notebook. He looked increasingly grim as he cataloged each one. His demeanor shifted as he worked through the collection, from professional interest to something more like resigned acknowledgement. Then he took me aside, while Angelo and Remington were dealing with the rest of our catch. He said to me directly, "Mr. Jorge, you've done your duty reporting this. That's good. That's the right thing to do. But I'm going to need you to understand something. What you found here, these are items that are better left where they were. You're going to sign some forms confirming you found these items and that you're turning them over to the county. You're going to give me your formal statement about where and when you found them. And then you're going to go back to fishing and not think about this anymore." I asked him what had happened, why there were wedding rings in the bay. He said it was a matter that had been investigated before and that had been resolved to the extent that it could be resolved. He said there were old cases involved, family situations that had been very difficult for people, and that reopening the investigation would cause nothing but pain to people who'd already suffered enough. His voice was steady, but there was something beneath the words that suggested he wasn't offering me a suggestion, but rather delivering an instruction. I asked him if people had gone missing. He didn't answer directly. He just said, "Mr. Jorge, in my experience, some things are better left as they are. The families of missing persons often find peace more easily when the mystery stays a mystery. Answers don't always bring comfort. Sometimes they bring more pain. You seem like a good man. You're going to want to help, to do the right thing. But sometimes the right thing is to understand that the system has reasons for doing things the way it does. The Pacific Northwest has a long history, and some of that history is better left undisturbed." He confiscated all 47 rings. He had me sign paperwork, acknowledging that I'd turned them over to the county sheriff's department. The forms were vague about what the items were, just listed as recovered evidence from commercial fishing net. He got my contact information and told me that if I had any further questions about the matter, I should contact the county prosecutor's office, but his tone made it clear that future questions would not be welcomed or appreciated. That was 33 years ago. I never heard anything about those rings again. I never saw any news coverage about what had happened or why they were in the water. I never got any follow-up from law enforcement. I asked around Tokeland a bit, trying to see if anyone else knew anything. There were rumors about missing persons from decades past, vague stories about people who disappeared under unclear circumstances, but nothing concrete. Nothing that would have helped me understand what I'd actually found in those nets. The fishing community has always operated under unwritten rules, and one of those rules is that you don't push too hard when authorities tell you something is better left alone. I followed that rule. Angelo and Remington followed that rule. We went back to fishing. We filled our quota and got paid for what we caught. We didn't discuss the rings among ourselves or with anyone else. Life moved on. The fishing seasons continued, the boats kept going out, and the bay kept its secrets. But I've never forgotten them. Every time I hauled in a net in Willapa Bay after that, I wondered if I'd find more. Every time I thought about that day, I wondered what had happened in the Pacific Northwest waters that had resulted in dozens of wedding rings sinking to the bottom of the bay. I wondered about the people whose rings they were, about the stories those rings represented. I wondered about the families that were probably missing answers. After I retired, I had more time to think about it. I did some research, looked through old newspaper archives in the library. I found scattered reports of missing persons in the Pacific Northwest region from the 1950s through the 1980s. Not an unusual number, really, considering the population of the region and the maritime activities. But the descriptions of some of the cases match details I'd heard in fishing community rumors. People who'd gone missing after trips to the water. People whose disappearances had never been fully explained. Couples who'd disappeared together. Individuals who'd vanished from boats or from docks. I also found information about Willapa Bay's history. There were stories about the bay that went back generations. Native tribes had stories about the water, about things that happened in the deep places. Early settlers had reported disappearances, unusual maritime incidents that nobody could quite explain. It was the kind of history that every working fishing community has. A layer of mystery and tragedy that nobody talks about too much because it's easier not to. I tried once, about 10 years after that incident, to contact the county prosecutor's office and ask about the status of the investigation into the rings. The woman I spoke with said there was no investigation. She said the rings had been cataloged and filed as evidence in a case that had been closed many years earlier, and that I couldn't access the details because it involved ongoing privacy concerns for family members. Her voice was cautious, like she was reading from a script. When I asked which case, she said she couldn't provide that information without a specific case number. And when I asked her how to get a case number for something that I'd personally reported, she said she couldn't help with that. She suggested I try the Department of Fish and Wildlife if I had questions about my reporting procedures. The conversation was polite but ultimately unhelpful. That's when I understood the full scope of it. The system knew exactly what those rings meant. The authorities understood the significance of finding 47 wedding rings in commercial fishing nets. And they had made the collective decision that this information was not meant to be public knowledge, that it was safer for everyone involved if the mystery remained a mystery, that sometimes the Pacific Northwest waters needed to keep their secrets. I'm telling this story now because I'm old and retired and don't have much to lose. The fishing community that taught me to keep quiet is mostly gone anyway. The salmon runs have declined so much that commercial fishing in Willapa Bay is barely viable anymore. The way of life that depended on certain codes of silence has already passed away. The younger generation doesn't have the same understanding of the unwritten rules that governed our community. But I want people to know that there are things in the Pacific Northwest waters that don't get talked about. There are disappearances that don't get fully investigated. There are mysteries that authorities have decided are better left as mysteries. And sometimes those mysteries end up in fishing nets, tangled with the season's catch, forcing fishermen to make decisions about whether to report them or throw them back. If you spend time on the water in Willapa Bay, or in the Pacific Northwest, waters in general, pay attention to what comes up in your nets. Pay attention to what seems out of place, and understand that there might be reasons why some people would prefer that certain things stay at the bottom of the bay. Whether that's actually the right way to handle it is a question that I've wrestled with for decades, and I still don't have a comfortable answer. My name is Ruby, and I'm 38 years old. I'm a pharmacist, licensed to practice in Washington State, and I inherited my family's independent pharmacy in P.L., a small town nestled in the Chehalis River Valley in Lewis County. The pharmacy had been in my family since 1949, when my grandfather opened it as part of the economic revival that came after P.L. survived the Great Depression. My father took over in 1971, and I was supposed to take over eventually, though I didn't expect that transition to happen until much later in life. When my father had a severe stroke in 2018, I had to step in ahead of schedule to keep the pharmacy operational. PEL is the kind of place where pharmacies still matter. We're not just filling prescriptions here. We're part of the community fabric. People come in not just for medications, but for advice, for conversation, for the kind of personalized attention that chain pharmacies can't provide. My grandfather understood that. My father understood that. And I wanted to continue that tradition of being a trusted resource for people's health and medication needs in the Pacific Northwest community. When I took over the pharmacy, one of the first things I did was begin organizing the extensive archives of records my family had maintained over decades. The federal regulations around pharmacy record keeping are strict. You're required to maintain prescription records for specific time periods. Most independent pharmacies maintain their records in a centralized location, but my family had done the additional work of keeping comprehensive files going back much further than legally required. In a climate-controlled storage room in the back of the pharmacy, I found boxes of files from the 1970s and 1980s. These were organized by year and contained not just the prescription records, but also documentation of the sources, the distributors, the lot numbers, everything. My grandfather and father had been meticulous. It was the kind of detailed record-keeping that would be difficult to imagine happening in a modern pharmacy, where everything is computerized and centralized through corporate management systems. I decided to begin digitizing some of these older records. I thought it would be interesting from a historical perspective to see what kind of medications were commonly prescribed in PL during different eras. The Pacific Northwest in the 1970s and early 1980s was a fascinating time pharmaceutically. There were experimental medications being tested, new approaches to treating various conditions, medications that have since been discontinued or heavily restricted due to safety concerns. It was during this digitization process that I noticed something unusual. Between 1976 and 1979, a significant portion of PL's population had been prescribed a medication called sertraline. According to the pharmaceutical records, it was described as an experimental sedative that had been approved for clinical trials in select communities. The prescription records indicated that nearly everyone in town who had come to the pharmacy during that period had filled at least one prescription for sertraline. The unusual part was the scope. The records showed that the medication had been prescribed not just to adults with documented sleep disorders or anxiety, but to children, infants even. According to the documentation, mothers had brought their babies in for pediatric formulations of sertraline. Children as young as 3 months old had prescriptions on file. The recommended dosages varied by age group, but the fact that an experimental sedative was being given to infants at all raised immediate red flags in my mind from an ethical standpoint. I pulled the specific records for my family. My father had been prescribed sertraline in 1977. My grandmother, who lived with my family then, had received a prescription for a senior formulation. My uncle, who was working at a local logging mill, had multiple prescriptions. Even my aunt, who worked at the school as a teacher, had filled prescriptions during the period. I reviewed the packaging information and documentation that came with the pharmacy's bulk orders of the medication. The paperwork indicated that sertraline was manufactured by a pharmaceutical company called Kirsten Pharmaceuticals, based out of Portland, Oregon. The documentation was sparse by modern standards. There was minimal information about side effects, drug interactions, or long-term safety data. The prescription authorization forms were signed by a local physician, Dr. Leland Waverly, who had been PL's primary care doctor during that period. I found this deeply troubling for several reasons. First, as a pharmacist trained in modern pharmaceutical ethics and regulations, the idea that an experimental medication could be given to an entire town, including infants, without what appeared to be documented informed consent was shocking. Second, the medication itself was listed in every regulatory database I could access, but there was virtually no published research on it. Third, I had no record of what had happened to the town after 1979 in terms of adverse effects or health outcomes related to the medication. I started my investigation methodically, like I'd been trained to do during pharmacy school and my licensing requirements. I contacted the DEA to ask about Serenolin and its approval status. They had records of it as an experimental compound that had been approved for clinical trials, but there was minimal documentation about which communities had participated in those trials or what the outcomes had been. The DEA contact I spoke with seemed to become uncomfortable when I mentioned the dosages given to infants and the apparent universal prescription to the entire town population. I then tried to contact Kirsten Pharmaceuticals directly. That's when the situation took a strange turn. The company no longer existed. I found records indicating it had been acquired by a larger pharmaceutical corporation in 1987 and subsequently dissolved. The acquiring company, when I contacted them, denied having any records of Serenolin in their archives. They suggested that if such a medication had existed, my pharmacy records must be fraudulent or misfiled. I pulled the physical prescriptions from the storage files to verify them. They were legitimate. The handwriting was consistent with Dr. Waverly's other prescriptions I had on file. The pharmacy billing records matched up with the prescription records. The supplier documentation showed bulk orders of Serenolin being delivered to my family's pharmacy multiple times during 1996, 1979. Everything was consistent and documented. These weren't fraudulent records. I tried contacting Dr. Waverly. He was retired and living in California. When I reached him by phone and explained what I'd found, there was a long silence. Then he said, "I'm not going to discuss that over the phone, and I'm going to strongly suggest you don't push that investigation any further." He hung up before I could respond. I became more focused after that refusal. I started reaching out to other entities that might have records or information about the Serenolin trial. I contacted the FDA, which had different records than the DEA but equally minimal documentation. I contacted the Washington State Department of Health, which had no records of any experimental pharmaceutical trial in PL during that period. I contacted the institutional review boards at nearby medical schools, trying to find any documentation of the research protocol that must have been necessary to conduct human trials. Nothing. Everywhere I looked, I found either no records or records that contradicted my pharmacy files. It was like the trial had been deliberately obscured or documented in a way that wouldn't leave a traceable path. I decided to try a different approach. I reached out to people in PL who had been living here during that time period. I spoke to elderly residents at the library and at community centers. I was careful about how I framed my questions. I said I was doing research on the medical history of PL because I was interested in understanding the community's health patterns from a historical perspective. What I discovered from these conversations was that many long-term residents remembered the 1970s as a relatively calm period for the town. People weren't particularly sick. There weren't unusual health crises, but many of them also expressed vague discomfort when I asked about that specific time period. Several said things like, "That was a strange time," or "People seemed different back then," without being able to articulate exactly what they meant. One elderly woman, Mrs. Kaysen, who had been a teacher in PL during that period, told me something that struck me deeply. She said, "Everyone was so calm. Everyone seemed content." I remember thinking that no town should be that peaceful. People don't exist in a state of complete calm and contentment. There's always friction, always someone with problems. But during those years, it was like the town was sleeping. I asked her if she'd been prescribed Serenolin. She said yes, she had. When I asked her if she remembered why, she couldn't articulate a specific reason. She said her doctor had recommended it, and she'd taken it, and she felt fine. But she also said that when she moved away from PL in 1980, It took her several months to feel like herself again. She said she'd been foggy during the entire Serenalin period and only started thinking clearly after she'd been off the medication for a while. I also reached out to a man named Bryce, who had grown up in PL during the 1970s. He was now living in Seattle but had moved back to visit family. I asked him about his memories of that period. He remembered receiving the medication as a child. He said his mother had taken him to the pharmacy and his doctor had prescribed it for him. He said he remembered feeling drowsy most of the time, but he'd accepted it as normal. He said only after he left town and stopped taking the medication did he realize how much it had affected his alertness and his ability to concentrate. I began experiencing a growing sense of ethical distress. As a pharmacist, I'm bound by codes of professional conduct that require me to act as an advocate for patient health and safety. The fact that I had documentation of what appeared to be an undisclosed medication experiment conducted on my entire community was something that demanded investigation and proper reporting. I contacted the Washington State Pharmacy Quality Assurance Commission, the regulatory body that oversees pharmacists in the state. I submitted a formal inquiry about Serenalin and the prescription records from my pharmacy. The response I received was cautious. They said they would look into it, but they also indicated that since the incident had occurred more than 40 years ago and was outside their current regulatory purview, there were limitations to what they could investigate. They recommended I contact the Washington State Medical Board about Dr. Waverly's involvement. But I also got the distinct sense from the conversation that this was something the state regulatory apparatus didn't particularly want to investigate. The representative I spoke with said, "You're raising some complex issues here, Ms. Ruby. There are privacy concerns for the individuals who received the medication. There are also questions about whether an investigation at this time would serve any practical purpose." I persisted. I decided to reach out to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, thinking that if an illegal pharmaceutical trial had been conducted without proper consent, that would be a matter for federal authorities. I submitted a detailed report outlining what I'd found in the pharmacy records and what I'd discovered through my research into the Pacific Northwest medical history. The FBI contacted me a week later. An agent named Victor came to PL and spent an afternoon in my pharmacy, reviewing the records I'd gathered. He was thorough and professional. He took extensive notes. He asked detailed questions about the sourcing of the medication, the prescribing physician, the distribution patterns, and what I discovered about Serenalin. At the end of the interview, he told me that they would look into it, but he also said something that made my stomach drop. He said, "Ms. Ruby, I need to be direct with you. There are aspects of this situation that involve national security considerations and classified research programs. I can't say more than that, but I would strongly recommend that you treat this matter as resolved. Archive your records properly. Don't pursue this further." I asked him what kind of classified research programs would involve giving experimental sedatives to an entire town, including infants. He didn't answer. He just repeated his recommendation that I not pursue the investigation further. It's been 5 years since that conversation. I've filed all the pharmacy records properly, documented everything according to protocol, and essentially done what I was advised to do. But the ethical distress hasn't gone away. I still think about Mrs. Kaysen saying that the entire town had been sleeping during that period. I still think about infants in PL being given experimental medication. I still think about Bryce and how many years it took him to realize how the medication had affected his childhood. I still think about the fact that somewhere in federal archives, there are probably records of a research program called something like Serenalin Trial, PL Washington, that the public doesn't have access to. As a pharmacist, I'm trained to follow protocol, to trust regulatory systems, to maintain professional confidentiality. But I'm also trained to put patient welfare first. And I have a growing suspicion that the welfare of the people of PL during the 1970s was sacrificed for some purpose that the federal government has deemed classified. If you live in a small town in the Pacific Northwest and you ever discover pharmaceutical records that don't make sense, that seem to document experiments rather than normal medical practice, I would advise you to proceed carefully. Contact professional regulatory bodies, yes, but also understand that there may be reasons why certain investigations are discouraged. The system sometimes has information it's not prepared to share, and it has ways of discouraging further inquiry that are subtle but effective. My name is Cash, and I'm 31 years old. I'm a software engineer working remotely for a tech company based in Portland, which means I can technically live anywhere with decent internet connectivity. After spending nearly 6 years in cramped urban apartments in Seattle, paying astronomical rents just to have a roof over my head, I started looking at rural Pacific Northwest towns as an alternative. Joseph, Oregon caught my attention. It's small, beautiful, nestled beneath the Wallowa Mountains, and most importantly, it's affordable. I found a rental house for $1,800 a month, which felt like I'd won the lottery compared to Seattle prices. I moved to Joseph in January 2022, thinking I'd finally escaped the rat race and found some peace and quiet. The town is genuinely beautiful. Main Street is lined with bronze sculptures, art galleries, boutique shops. The surrounding mountains are spectacular. For the first few weeks, it felt like I'd made the right decision. I got comfortable working from my living room, watching the Wallowa Mountains shift colors with the changing light throughout the day. Then the gifts started appearing on my porch. It began around mid-February. I went outside one morning to check the mail, and there was a mason jar sitting on my front steps. Inside were wildflowers. Nothing fancy, just attractive seasonal flowers, arranged simply but carefully. There was no note, no card, no indication of who had left it. I assumed it was a welcome gift from a neighbor, which seemed like a genuinely kind gesture. I put the flowers in a vase inside and forgot about it. 2 days later, another mason jar appeared on my porch. Same type of wildflowers, same arrangement, same lack of any identifying information. This time I paid more attention. I looked around to see if anyone was watching, if someone from a neighboring house was checking to see my reaction. I didn't see anyone. I brought the flowers inside and felt a slight flutter of something. Not quite concern, but definitely curiosity mixed with a sense of strangeness. Over the next week, mason jars with wildflowers appeared 3 more times. Always at night. Always left on my front steps. Always containing the same type of arrangement. I started paying attention to the timing, the patterns, the specific flowers used. They were always fresh, always carefully arranged. It was clearly deliberate, clearly intentional. This wasn't random. This was coordinated. I asked neighbors about it, trying to be casual. One woman down the street named Isla said it was just how folks show hospitality in Joseph. She said it was a local tradition, a way of welcoming newcomers. She seemed surprised that I'd found it unusual. She said the welcome committee sometimes leaves gifts for new residents, and I should consider it a compliment. Her casual demeanor about the whole thing made me doubt my own instincts for a moment. The welcome committee. I hadn't heard of any official organization like that, but Isla seemed certain about it. She said it was an informal group of longtime residents who made sure newcomers felt welcomed. She said they were very dedicated to the community and that I should probably reciprocate the gesture by leaving something on their porches to show appreciation. The way she emphasized very dedicated stuck with me. There was something in her tone that suggested this was more than just a harmless tradition. But here's where things started to feel wrong. I didn't know who the welcome committee members were. I didn't know who was leaving the flowers. And I wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea of someone coming onto my property night after night, leaving gifts, without identifying themselves. The frequency was increasing. The deliberateness was unmistakable. I decided to set up a Ring doorbell camera to document what was happening. I wanted to see who was leaving the flowers and at what time. If it was genuinely just a welcome ritual, documenting it seemed harmless. If it was something else, I wanted evidence. I installed it myself, making sure the lens had a clear view of my front porch and the walkway leading to it. The camera footage from the first night was illuminating and deeply unsettling. At approximately 11:47 p.m., someone approached my house. The person was wearing dark clothing, their face obscured by the hood of a jacket. They walked up to my front porch, placed a mason jar of wildflowers on the steps, and then turned directly toward my front door. They looked directly at the camera lens for several seconds. It was impossible to tell if they knew it was there or if it was just coincidence, before turning and walking away. The moment was captured in perfect detail on the video footage. What disturbed me most was the deliberateness of the action. This wasn't casual. This wasn't someone just quickly dropping off flowers. This was someone moving with intention, aware of their surroundings, moving deliberately onto my property. The way they looked at the camera suggested they knew I was watching, or that they wanted me to know I was being watched. I didn't reciprocate. I decided I wasn't comfortable with the tradition, and I wasn't going to leave gifts on the porches of people I didn't know and whose identities had been hidden from me. I made the decision consciously, understanding that refusing to participate might have social consequences in a small town. That's when things escalated. 3 days after I chose not to reciprocate, I found an envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a photograph. It showed the interior of my bedroom, taken from inside the room. You could see my bed, my nightstand, my clothes on a chair. The photo had been taken during the day. You could see sunlight coming through the windows. But I lived alone. No one had been in my house without my permission. I hadn't invited anyone inside. I called the police immediately. I showed them the photograph, explained the pattern of nighttime visits, described the Ring doorbell footage. The officer who came to my house listened to my explanation, reviewed the video, looked at the photo. His response chilled me to my core and made me understand that I was in a situation where the normal rules of privacy and safety didn't necessarily apply. He said, "Yeah, this is just how the Welcome Committee operates. They're trying to integrate you into the community. Leaving gifts is one part of it. The photo is just, it's their way of showing that you're part of the community now. They're letting you know they've noticed you." I asked him how someone got into my locked bedroom and took a photograph. He said, "Well, they probably waited until you weren't home and came inside. The doors here in Joseph aren't usually locked. It's kind of a trust thing. Most people leave their doors unlocked." I told him I did lock my doors. I told him I had a security system. I told him that someone breaking into my house and photographing my bedroom was not hospitality. It was a violation and likely a crime. My voice was rising as I explained this, my frustration and fear becoming audible. He said, "Mr. Cash, I understand you're concerned, but this is how things work in a small community like Joseph. You're new. You're from the city. You're used to a different way of life. The Welcome Committee is trying to help you feel at home. I'd suggest you reciprocate the gesture. Leave some gifts on the porches of some community members. Participate in the tradition. Things will calm down once you've shown you're willing to be part of the community." I didn't feel assured. I felt terrified. I asked if he would file a report about the break-in and the photograph. He said he would note it in his report, but he also emphasized that he didn't think it constituted a criminal matter. He said no property had been damaged, nothing had been stolen. His dismissal of my concerns was complete and absolute. I increased my security measures after that. I installed additional cameras covering my front and back doors. I installed motion sensor lights that would illuminate anyone approaching the house. I made sure all windows were locked. I stopped leaving my doors unlocked, even during the day. I engaged every security measure I could think of. Then the photographs became more frequent and more invasive. One showed my kitchen, taken from inside my house. Another showed my living room with specific detail that suggested the photographer had walked through the space. Another showed my bathroom. Each photograph was dated on the back with a specific date and time. The photos spanned a period of approximately 2 weeks. Someone had been inside my locked house at least 7 times. They had photographed multiple rooms. They had documented their access with dates and times, creating a record of their intrusions. I called the police again. This time I spoke with a different officer, someone higher in the chain of command. I explained what was happening. I showed him all the photographs. I showed him the Ring doorbell footage of the night visits. I asked for a proper investigation into breaking and entering and harassment. I explained that I felt unsafe in my own home. His response was similar to the first officer's, but with an added edge of impatience. He said, "Mr. Cash, this is a small community. People here have different values than you do in Seattle. The Welcome Committee is an established tradition in Joseph. They're not trying to hurt you. They're trying to bring you into the fold. If you're not willing to participate in community traditions, then frankly, you're going to continue having these problems. I'd suggest you take the hint and either reciprocate the gesture or move on." I moved on. I packed up my belongings and left Joseph in April 2022, about 3 months after I arrived. I found a remote work situation that allowed me to relocate, and I moved back to the city, back to the Pacific Northwest urban environment where my autonomy wasn't being questioned and where my locked doors actually remained locked. I drove away from Joseph with a sense of relief mixed with a feeling of failure. But I've never fully processed what happened in Joseph. Was it a coordinated harassment campaign by the Welcome Committee? Was it a test to see if newcomers were willing to integrate into the community? Was it something more sinister that I was fortunate enough to escape by leaving? I still have the photographs. I still have the Ring doorbell footage. I still have documentation of every incident. I've considered reaching out to journalists, to investigators, to people who might be interested in what appears to be a systematic pattern of behavior targeting newcomers in a small Oregon town. But I'm also aware of how it would sound. A remote worker moved to a small town, experienced some unusual but non-violent community rituals, and then left because he was uncomfortable. There's nothing that crosses a clear legal line. There's nothing that would definitively prove criminal intent. The police officer's interpretation that this is just an unusual but established community tradition would be difficult to counter with the evidence I have. What troubles me most is that I was dismissed. My concerns about someone repeatedly entering my locked house and photographing my private spaces were dismissed as me not understanding how things work in a small community. My desire for privacy and autonomy was characterized as an inability to adapt to community values. I've thought about the other remote workers and newcomers who have moved to Joseph, attracted by the same things that drew me: the affordable housing, the beautiful scenery, the promise of a quiet, artistic community. I wonder how many of them have experienced the Welcome Committee. I wonder how many of them have photographs they can't explain. I wonder how many of them simply accepted it as part of the integration process because they were told that's how things are done. If you're thinking about moving to a small town in the Pacific Northwest, particularly if you're coming from a more urban environment, understand that community traditions can sometimes cross lines that urban residents would consider violations. Understand that just how things work here is not always a justification for behavior that would be illegal in other places. And if someone is entering your locked home and taking photographs of your private spaces without your permission, that's not hospitality. That's something else entirely. Trust your instincts. Document everything, and be prepared to leave if you're not comfortable with the unwritten rules that govern the community. My name is Parker, and I'm 44 years old. I've been teaching elementary school in Elma, Washington for nearly 20 years. Elma is a small community in Grays Harbor County, nestled between the timber country and the more developed western areas of the Puget Sound region. It's the kind of place where most people have extended family ties to the area, where teachers often teach the children of their former students, where community institutions have deep historical roots and long institutional memories. The school I taught at was built in 1967, and for most of its existence, it had maintained careful archives of school events, programs, and yearbooks. In 2019, I was approached by the school principal at the time, Natalia Reeves, about organizing the school's historical photograph archives. The school had accumulated decades of photographs from yearbooks, school events, performances, and community activities. Many of these photographs were in fragile condition, stored in boxes in the school library's basement. Natalia thought it would be valuable to digitize them, catalog them, and create a searchable database that could be used for the school's historical records and potentially shared with alumni. I was enthusiastic about the project. I'd always been interested in the school's history and the role it played in the community. The Pacific Northwest has a rich history, and small towns like Elma have stories that deserve to be documented and preserved. I spent my evenings and weekends over the course of several months carefully examining photographs, scanning them with archival quality equipment, and organizing them chronologically. I created detailed metadata for each image, noting the date, the event, the people visible in the photo, any relevant context about what was happening at the school or in the community at that time. The photographs spanned from 1963, which was approximately when the school's systematic photo archival process began, all the way through to contemporary images from 2019. I was fascinated by watching the evolution of the school, the changing fashion and hairstyles, the way the community transformed over 5 decades. I saw photos of school assemblies from the 1960s, classroom activities from various eras, sports events featuring students in vintage uniforms, theatrical productions with programs I could identify by date, graduation ceremonies showing the progression of generations, and community gatherings that reflected the town's traditions and values. It was during this archival process that I noticed something unusual. In a significant number of photographs, spanning multiple decades, there was a man in the background. Not prominently featured, but definitely present. He appeared in photos from 1963, in photos from the 1970s, in photos from the 1990s, and in recent photographs from 2018 and 2019. In every single photograph, he was positioned in a way that gave him a clear view of the children in the image. He was always watching, and he had not aged. At first, I thought I was seeing a pattern that wasn't really there. Confirmation bias, the tendency to see connections where none exist. But the more carefully I examined the images, the more certain I became. The man in the background photos had the same face across 56 years of school photographs, the same facial structure and features, despite changes in photography technology and film stock. That's not possible. That's not how aging works. That's not how the human body changes over time. I documented this carefully. I created a folder on my computer containing all the photographs in which this man appeared. I arranged them chronologically and examined them side by side. The facial features were consistent. The appearance was virtually identical across the entire time span. There was no visible aging, no changes in hair color beyond what could be explained by different photography lighting or film stock from different eras, no changes in physical appearance that would be consistent with normal human aging across half a century. The consistency was unsettling. I also noticed something else. In every photograph where this man appeared, he was positioned near the children. He wasn't a faculty member. I knew all the teachers and staff from the school's records and institutional documentation. He wasn't a parent. The photos were labeled with names and family connections. He was someone who appeared in photographs of school events, but wasn't identified anywhere in the school's records or archives. He had no official role in the school community. I became obsessed with this discovery. I spent hours examining the photographs, trying to understand what I was looking at. I created a detailed timeline. I looked for patterns in when he appeared and when he didn't. I cross-referenced photographs with yearbooks and school records. I noticed that he appeared less frequently in recent years, but he still appeared occasionally. Most recently, he was visible in a photograph from a school assembly in May of 2019, positioned at the back of the auditorium, watching the children on stage perform in an end-of-year event. I decided I needed to talk to someone about this. I approached Principal Natalia and explained what I discovered. I showed her the chronological arrangement of photographs. I explained that the same man appeared across 56 years without any visible aging. I expressed my concern about who this person was and why he had been present at school events for so many decades without any official capacity or identification. Natalia's reaction was immediate and surprising. She became visibly agitated. Her face drained of color. She asked me to show her all the photographs, and I did. She examined them carefully, her hands shaking slightly as she handled the physical prints. Then she told me that I needed to delete the digital copies I'd made, stop working on the archival project immediately, and not discuss this with anyone. Her voice was firm and left no room for negotiation. I asked her who the man was. She said it was a complex situation that involved historical school matters that were better left undiscussed. She said that bringing this up would cause unnecessary alarm and potentially damage the school's reputation. She said that if I valued my position at the school, I should not pursue this further. The implication was clear. Challenging this would have professional consequences. I felt a chill run through me. I was being told to ignore what I discovered. I was being told to destroy evidence. I was being told that the safety and security of the children at the school was less important than protecting the school's reputation and whatever institutional secret this discovery had uncovered. I didn't delete the photographs. Instead, I made copies of the files and stored them on a personal external hard drive in a secure location. I documented everything I'd found in detailed written notes. I continued to research, trying to understand what I was looking at. I began keeping a personal journal of my observations and my interactions with school administration. About a week after my conversation with Natalia, I was called into her office. She told me that my contract would not be renewed for the next school year. She said it was due to restructuring and budget constraints. She said it had nothing to do with my recent discovery about the photographs, but the timing was too suspicious to be coincidental. I had taught at the school for nearly 20 years without any performance issues or contract problems. I asked her directly if this was retaliation for bringing up my concerns about the man in the photographs. She said, "Ms. Parker, I'm going to be very direct with you. There are things about this school's history that are not meant to be discussed publicly. There are reasons why certain matters are kept confidential. Your insistence on pursuing this is creating problems for the institution. I would strongly suggest you accept the non-renewal, find a position elsewhere, and move on." I was transferred to a different school district, one farther away from my community, one where I had to spend more time commuting. The transfer was presented as an opportunity, but it felt like punishment. It felt like being exiled for asking questions about something that the school administration wanted to keep hidden from public knowledge. I've spent the years since then thinking about what I discovered. I've continued to examine the photographs on my personal copies. The pattern is undeniable. A man who appears consistently in school photographs across 5 decades, never aging, always watching the children, and an institution that actively worked to suppress my investigation and remove me from my position when I tried to bring the matter to light. I've researched missing children cases in Grays Harbor County. I've looked through cold case, files archived at the library, and online. I've tried to understand if there's a connection between this man and any unexplained disappearances or incidents in the community. I've found scattered reports of children who went missing over the decades, but nothing that definitively connects them to the man in the photographs. What I have found is institutional resistance to the investigation at every turn. I've tried to contact the school district's superintendent about my discovery. I've tried to reach out to law enforcement agencies. I've submitted inquiries to county archives. In every case, I've been met with the same response, that this is a matter that has already been looked into, or that there are privacy concerns that prevent further investigation. I'm sharing this story now because I've transferred out of the original school district. I'm working in a different area now, teaching children who are safe, as far as I know. But I think about the students at that school in Elma. I think about the fact that a man who appears in photographs, spanning 56 years, never aging, always watching children, may still be present in that community. I think about the institutional forces that work to suppress my investigation and protect the school's reputation over the safety of children. The school administration made it clear to me that certain uncomfortable truths about the institution's history were not meant to be publicly discussed. They made it clear that my duty to protect children was superseded by my duty to protect the school's reputation. And they made it clear that if I persisted in pursuing these questions, there would be professional consequences for my career. I still have the photographs. I still have my documentation of what I discovered. I still have the evidence that something very wrong has been happening in the Pacific Northwest school system, and that people in positions of authority have chosen to cover it up rather than address it. I have kept these materials despite institutional pressure to destroy them. If you're a parent in the Pacific Northwest, particularly in small communities, I would urge you to pay close attention to the people who appear in the background of school photographs and school events. Pay attention to anyone who seems to be consistently present at school events but isn't identified as staff or faculty. And if you notice something unusual, something that doesn't make sense, don't accept the institutional reassurances. Don't accept being told that this is not your concern or that it's already been handled. Your children's safety is worth more than the reputation of any institution. My name is Maximus, and I'm 55 years old. I work as the county historian for Catitas County, Washington, a position I've held for the past 17 years. My role involves maintaining historical records, researching the region's past, and helping preserve the stories and documentation of the communities that make up the county. The Pacific Northwest has a complex and often tragic mining history, and Catitas County is no exception. Roslyn, in particular, is a town with deep roots in the coal mining industry and carries within its history events that shaped the region's economy and social structure. I became particularly interested in researching the 1924 mine collapse because there was a memorial in the town dedicated to the miners who died. The memorial was erected in 1925, a year after the disaster, and for decades it stood in the town square as a reminder of the town's sacrifice. The official death toll recorded on the memorial was 19 miners, 19 men lost in a tunnel collapse deep beneath Roslyn. It was a tragedy, certainly, but not unprecedented for mining towns of that era. But when I began cross-referencing the memorial with official census records and mining company employment documents, I discovered a significant discrepancy. According to the 1924 census, conducted in July of that year, just a few months before the mine collapse occurred, there were 43 miners officially registered as living and working in Roslyn. 43, not 19. The number didn't match, and the inconsistency troubled me professionally and ethically. I started researching more deeply. I pulled mining company payroll records from the Northern Pacific Coal Company archives, which are maintained at the county courthouse. I found employment records showing that in 1924, the company had listed 43 workers on the active payroll for the Roslyn operation. I reviewed accident reports and death certificates. I looked through newspaper archives from that time period. Everything pointed to the same discrepancy. The census showed 43 miners, but only 19 bodies had been recovered from the collapse. I began to wonder if there had been additional deaths that had been omitted from the official record. I looked for unmarked graves in the Roslyn Cemetery, walking through the grounds and examining headstones and plot markers. I searched through death certificates filed in 1924 and 1925 at the county clerk's office. I examined insurance company records that might have documented claims from families of deceased miners. I tried to find any documentation that would explain what had happened to the 24 miners who weren't accounted for in the official death toll. What I found was silence, deliberate, systematic silence. There were no death certificates for those 24 men. There were no insurance claims filed on their behalf. There were no newspaper reports of additional deaths. The local papers from that era were sparse and often controlled by interests aligned with the mining company. It was as if those 24 miners simply ceased to exist after July 1924, their passing unrecorded and unacknowledged in any official capacity. I decided to investigate further by looking at what happened to the families of these officially unaccounted for miners. I researched property records using historical deeds and land transfers, looking for homes that had belonged to miners and tracing what happened to them. I looked for pension records, survivor benefits, anything that might indicate what the mining company or the town had done for the families of these missing men. The historical documentation was fragmented, but patterns began to emerge. This is where I discovered something truly unsettling. In the official records of the Northern Pacific Coal Company, there was documentation of payments being made to what was listed as a hardship relief fund, maintained specifically for Roslyn. The payments continued long after the 1924 disaster. In fact, they continued through the entire period of the coal mining operation in Roslyn and actually extended beyond that, persisting into the modern era. I requested access to the specific details of this relief fund. The county records office had limited documentation, but what they did have indicated that payments were being made regularly to individuals identified only by initials rather than full names. The amounts varied, but they seemed consistent with what might be considered survivor benefits or dependency payments made to families. The most remarkable part of this discovery was that the relief fund appeared to have no official authorization. There was no trust document. There was no will. There was no court order establishing it. Yet the payments continued, documented in bank ledgers and accounting records, with money being transferred from what appeared to be company accounts into accounts managed by unnamed intermediaries who distributed funds to the recipients. I contacted surviving descendants of miners who I knew had worked for the company. I approached this very carefully, not wanting to alarm anyone or make accusations I couldn't substantiate. I asked if any of them knew anything about regular payments their families had received related to the 1924 disaster. What I learned was remarkable and deeply troubling. Multiple families reported receiving anonymous payments over the years. Some described receiving money as children, their parents explaining only that it was related to their grandfather's death in the mines. The payments had varied in frequency and amount, but they had been consistent enough that families had come to expect them. Some families reported continuing to receive payments into the 2000s, decades after the official closure of the mines, and long after any reasonable statute of limitations on corporate liability might have applied. None of these families knew the source of the payments. None of them had ever been contacted by anyone explaining the origin of the money. The payments simply appeared, often deposited directly into bank accounts or delivered in cash through intermediaries who never identified themselves or their employers. I began assembling a timeline with meticulous documentation. In 1924, 43 miners were registered as working in Roslyn. 19 bodies were recovered from the collapse and officially counted as dead. 24 miners disappeared from the official record. Yet their families and the descendants of their families continued to receive payments from what appeared to be an unofficial trust fund for at least 70 years, perhaps longer. The economics of this were disturbing to contemplate. Someone had to authorize these payments. Someone had to maintain the fund across decades and generations. Someone had to track the descendants and ensure the payments reached them even as family structures changed, people moved away, and connections to the original events became more distant. This wasn't accidental. This was deliberate, coordinated concealment of a much larger disaster than the 19-death official story. I tried to find documentation that might explain what had happened to those 24 men. Were they trapped deeper in the mine and never recovered? Were they buried in unmarked graves somewhere in the Pacific Northwest? Had they actually survived but been erased from official records for some reason? Did they flee the region and try to disappear? I found no definitive answers despite extensive research. What I did find was that any attempt to investigate this further ran into institutional resistance. When I requested additional access to mining company records, I was told that many of them had been lost or were considered proprietary business information that couldn't be publicly disclosed. When I tried to contact relatives of the mining company's management to ask questions, I was rebuffed or told that such matters were private family business, not meant for public discussion. I submitted my research findings to the county board. I suggested that we consider re-examining the 1924 mine disaster and updating the official record to reflect the discrepancies I'd discovered. The board's response was cautious and dismissive. They said that such matters were historical in nature, and that reopening old investigations could potentially cause distress to families without providing any actual benefit to the community. They recommended that I focus my historical research on less contentious aspects of Kittitas County history that might present the region in a more positive light. The message was clear. The county didn't want this discrepancy examined publicly. The truth about what had happened to those 24 miners was to remain buried, along with whatever secrets the mining company and the town authorities had been keeping for nearly a century. The institutional forces that benefited from silence were far more powerful than any individual historian's commitment to accuracy and truth. But I couldn't let it go. I continued my research privately, outside of my official county historian role. I spent my own time and money traveling to archives in other locations, contacting descendants of the miners, trying to piece together what had actually happened in Roslyn in 1924. I visited state and federal archives, searched microfilm collections, interviewed elderly residents who had family connections to the mining operation. What emerged was a picture of a catastrophe much larger than the official record acknowledged. The evidence suggested that the actual death toll from the mine collapse was not 19, but something closer to 43. All of them. Every miner who went into that tunnel that day. And the town, the mining company, and the county authorities had collectively decided that acknowledging this would be economically and socially damaging to the region. The relief payments were evidence of institutional guilt. Someone knew the truth. Someone had made the decision that secretly paying off the families of the dead miners was preferable to publicly acknowledging the full scale of the disaster. The payments were hush money, compensation that was provided without acknowledgement, without apology, without any official recognition that a much larger tragedy had occurred than the historical record reflected. I'm sharing this story now because I'm approaching retirement. I've spent my career trying to document and preserve the history of Kittitas County, including its difficult and painful chapters. But there are some truths that the institutions of this region are not prepared to acknowledge publicly. The people of Roslyn know their mining history is complicated. They know there were disasters and deaths. But they may not know that the official story of 1924 is incomplete. They may not know that there are descendants of miners who never received proper acknowledgement for their loss, whose ancestors' deaths were covered up in exchange for anonymous financial compensation that continued for 70 years or more. If you live in a Pacific Northwest mining community, or if your family history is connected to the mining industry, pay close attention to the official narratives about disasters. Look for discrepancies between census records and official death tolls. Ask questions about why certain stories don't quite add up. And understand that the economics of tragedy sometimes work in ways designed to keep the full truth hidden. My name is Allison, and I'm 36 years old. I work as a search and rescue volunteer coordinator for Deschutes County, Oregon, responsible for managing the volunteer teams that respond to missing persons incidents throughout the region, particularly in the Three Sisters Wilderness area near Sisters, Oregon. I've held this position for 8 years, and before that, I worked for 5 years as an active SAR team member. I'm deeply passionate about wilderness safety and the coordination of rescue operations. The Pacific Northwest wilderness is beautiful and draws thousands of visitors annually, but it's also unforgiving and can turn dangerous quickly for unprepared or unlucky hikers. Part of my responsibility is maintaining detailed records of all missing persons incidents in our search area. When I took over the coordinator position, I inherited a filing system that had been maintained sporadically, with some incidents documented thoroughly and others barely recorded at all. I decided to create a comprehensive database of all missing persons cases going back 15 years. I wanted to establish a systematic way to track patterns, improve our response protocols, and identify any areas or circumstances that might warrant special attention or additional safety measures. As I compiled the data, I began noticing something disturbing. Between 2009 and 2024, there had been 11 missing persons incidents along a specific 3-mile stretch of the Cascade Lakes Highway Trail. 11, all along the same section of trail, all experienced hikers or outdoors people. The probability of this being random was virtually impossible to calculate. The details were consistent and unsettling. In each case, the hiker had gone out for a day hike along a well-established trail. In each case, they either failed to return or were reported missing after not checking in when expected. In each case, search teams eventually located the hiker's gear arranged in organized piles. Clothing was found folded neatly. Backpacks were positioned carefully. The arrangement wasn't random. It was deliberate. I compiled the specific incidents. In 2009, an experienced hiker disappeared along the trail. Their gear was found 3 days later, arranged in a neat pile on the trail. No body was ever recovered. In 2011, a professional outdoor guide went missing on the same stretch. Her equipment was found folded and arranged, but she was never located. In 2013, an experienced mountaineer vanished. His gear was discovered organized on a rock outcropping. The pattern continued. 2014, 2015, twice in 2016, 2017, 2019, 2021, and most recently in 2023 and 2024. 11 incidents, all experienced outdoors people, all gone without trace, all leaving behind gear that was carefully arranged rather than abandoned haphazardly. I compiled all the documentation and presented it to Sunny, my supervisor at the County Search and Rescue Office. I suggested that this pattern warranted investigation and that the Forest Service might consider closing that section of trail pending further investigation. I presented the data systematically, with GPS coordinates, incident reports, and photographs of how the gear had been arranged. The response I received was disappointing. Sunny acknowledged the pattern, but said it was statistically insignificant, given the number of hikers using the trail annually. The Forest Service was consulted, and their response was even more dismissive. They said there was insufficient evidence of danger to warrant a trail closure. They noted that the gear being arranged neatly was probably just coincidence, and that experienced hikers might organize their equipment in a similar way when facing an emergency situation. I was frustrated by this response. This wasn't coincidence. This was a pattern, a clear, documented pattern of experienced hikers disappearing and leaving behind meticulously arranged equipment. But I was told to continue monitoring and report any further incidents. I did more research. I looked at the specific location where each disappearance occurred. They weren't randomly distributed along the 3-mile stretch. They clustered around a particular half-mile section of trail near a rocky outcropping and a dense grove of Douglas firs. This half-mile section was the location of 8 of the 11 incidents. I analyzed the timeline. I noticed that most disappearances occurred during off-season times, late September through October, early April, periods when the trail was less heavily used. I noted the times of day the hikers typically went missing. Most disappeared in late afternoon or early evening, around the time when light was becoming limited. I prepared a more detailed report. I included maps with GPS coordinates showing the clustering. I included photographs of the gear arrangements. I included data on the experience levels of the missing hikers. I included my analysis of the temporal patterns. I submitted this to the Forest Service and to the county sheriff's office. The response was resistance and obstruction. The Forest Service stated that closing the trail would have significant economic impact on the local recreation and tourism industry. They noted that Sisters was a small town that depended on tourism. They said that suggesting the trail was dangerous based on a pattern I'd identified could damage the town's reputation as a hiking destination. The county sheriff said there was no evidence of foul play. There were no bodies. There were no obvious signs of violence. The gear arrangements could be explained as the natural result of hikers organizing their belongings when facing an emergency. Without a body or direct evidence of a crime, they couldn't justify the resources to conduct an investigation. I pressed further. I said that the probability of this pattern occurring randomly was extraordinarily low. I said that the arrangement of the gear suggested deliberate placement rather than panic or accidental arrangement. I said that the clustering of incidents and the temporal patterns suggested something systematic was happening. I was told that my analysis, while detailed, was speculative. I was told that I should focus on my actual responsibilities rather than pursuing conspiracy theories. I was told that if I continued to make suggestions about closing the trail, it could create problems for the county's relationship with the Forest Service. I've stopped making official reports, but I continue documenting. I maintain my own database. I note every incident that occurs along that stretch of trail. I photograph the gear arrangements. I talk to searchers and try to understand what they're finding. Most recently, in October 2024, another hiker went missing along the same trail. Their name was different from the others, and their background, they were relatively new to the area, differed from the typical pattern. But their gear was found, folded neatly, arranged carefully, on a rock outcropping about a quarter mile from where another hiker's gear had been found in 2011. I reported this to Sonny. I suggested that we needed to escalate this to state authorities or to the FBI, given the pattern and the possibility of something criminal happening. Sonny told me to stop pursuing this line of investigation. He said it was making people uncomfortable and creating unnecessary alarm. I'm sharing this story now because I feel a responsibility to the hikers who use those trails and to the families of those who've gone missing. I feel a responsibility to acknowledge the pattern that I see clearly documented in my database. I feel a responsibility to speak the truth about what appears to be happening in the Three Sisters wilderness. The arrangement of gear, the experience of the hikers, the clustering, the temporal patterns, All of these factors suggest that something systematic is occurring along that half-mile stretch of trail, something that the Forest Service and local authorities are either unable or unwilling to acknowledge. If you're hiking in the Pacific Northwest, particularly in the Three Sisters Wilderness or similar areas, pay close attention to the trail and to other hikers. If you notice anything unusual arrangements of gear, strangers who seem to be watching hikers, patterns that seem deliberate rather than accidental, report it to Forest Service rangers or to local authorities. And if you find that your concerns are being dismissed or minimized, don't accept that dismissal. Your observations matter. Your safety matters. And patterns, when they're as clear as this one, shouldn't be ignored simply because acknowledging them creates economic or administrative problems for communities. My name is Anna, and I'm 49 years old. I work as a medical records clerk for the primary insurance provider that covers residents of Whidbey Island and the surrounding areas. I've held this position for the past 15 years, processing insurance claims, verifying patient information, and maintaining the administrative infrastructure that allows healthcare providers and insurance companies to communicate through standardized billing protocols. Coupeville, the county seat of Island County, Washington, is a small historic town that serves as a hub for the island's residents. The work of processing medical claims is meticulous, detail-oriented, and usually mundane, but in that mundanity, I discovered something deeply unsettling. My job involves reviewing claim submissions from healthcare providers, verifying that they meet our insurance guidelines, checking diagnosis codes against procedure codes to ensure they're consistent, and processing payment according to our fee schedules and contractual arrangements with providers. I work with medical billing terminology daily, procedure codes, diagnosis codes, claim adjustment reason codes, date of service, allowed amounts, charge entries. These are the building blocks of the healthcare reimbursement system. About 6 months ago, I was processing a batch of claims submitted by a local therapist, Dr. Joaquin Castro, who operates a private mental health practice on Whidbey Island. The claims were submitted using standard CMS 1500 forms, and they appeared to follow all the correct formatting protocols. But something about the pattern struck me as unusual. I noticed that Dr. Castro was billing our insurance company for mental health treatment sessions, specifically psychotherapy services billed under diagnosis codes for various mental health conditions. The frequency of the billing was remarkable. Nearly every week, we received claims from Dr. Castro's office for identical 45-minute sessions with what appeared to be different patients, all billed using the same procedure codes and identical durations. I pulled the claims data for the past several years and began analyzing the patterns. What I discovered was astonishing. According to our claims database, Dr. Castro had been billing our insurance company consistently and continuously since 1987, nearly 40 years, for weekly psychotherapy sessions. The remarkable part was the scope. Over 200 island residents appeared in our claims database as regular patients of Dr. Castro, all receiving identical 45-minute weekly sessions. 200 people. In a town where Coupeville's population was approximately 2,000 residents, that meant nearly 10% of the entire town's population was receiving regular weekly therapy from the same provider. The probability of this occurring naturally was extraordinarily low. Most therapists have patient populations distributed across different providers and different locations. The concentration of Dr. Castro's patient base was statistically improbable. I decided to verify the address listed for Dr. Castro's office. According to our claim submissions, his office was located at a specific street address on the eastern side of Whidbey Island. I drove to that address to conduct a visual verification. What I found was an empty field, not a building, not a converted residence. An empty field with overgrown vegetation and no structure of any kind. This was a red flag for insurance fraud. The basic rule of insurance fraud is that you cannot bill for services not rendered at a legitimate address. An address that consisted of an empty field would be immediately flagged in any competent insurance verification system. Yet the claims had been processed continuously for nearly 40 years. I escalated this to my supervisor, Wade, at the insurance company. I provided him with the claims data, the analysis of the frequency and consistency of the billing, and the documentation that the address was an empty field. Wade reviewed my findings and seemed concerned. He said he would look into it and would need to contact our compliance department. Within 2 days, Wade called me back. He told me that the matter had been reviewed by our legal department and our compliance department, and that they had determined there was insufficient evidence to pursue an investigation into potential fraud. He told me that without the provider admitting to fraud or without explicit evidence that no services had been rendered, insurance companies typically cannot investigate or deny claims that meet technical billing requirements. I was stunned. The technical billing requirements had been met, yes, but the entire situation violated logical probability. A therapist with 200 weekly patients, all receiving identical treatments at an address that didn't exist, with consistent billing for nearly 4 decades. This wasn't subtle fraud. This was systematic, obvious, and continuous. I asked Wade if we couldn't at least contact Dr. Castro to verify that he was actually providing services to these patients. Wade said that would require us to violate high-pay regulations, which protect patient privacy and limit insurance companies' ability to directly investigate provider-patient relationships without clear evidence of fraud. I requested access to our archived claims data to see how far back the pattern extended. What I discovered was that the claims had indeed been submitted continuously since 1987. Decades of weekly sessions for dozens and then hundreds of patients at an impossible address. Our insurance company had paid millions of dollars in claims to a provider at a location that didn't exist. I began researching Dr. Castro online. There was no professional licensing information available, no references to his practice in any medical directories, no office phone number that worked, no way to verify that he was a licensed mental health professional in Washington state. I escalated my concerns again, this time requesting a formal investigation. Wade told me that pursuing this further could create liability issues for the insurance company if it turned out that the patients actually did exist and were actually receiving services through some mechanism I didn't understand. He said that sometimes reality works in ways that defy easy explanation and that I should accept the claims as processed and move on. I didn't move on. I continued monitoring the claims data. The payments continued. Every week, new claims were submitted for weekly therapy sessions from Dr. Castro's office. Every week, our insurance company processed the claims and paid them. The money kept flowing to an account associated with an address that was an empty field. Most disturbing was the patient list. Over 200 different people, many of whom I knew from the community. Residents I recognized from the local grocery store, the library, community events, all listed as regular patients of a therapist whose practice existed only on paper, at an address that didn't exist. I started asking carefully worded questions in the community. I spoke to people I knew and asked casually if they'd ever used mental health services on the island. What I found was that most people denied having seen any therapist. Yet their names appeared in our insurance claims database as regular patients of Dr. Castro receiving weekly treatment. I also noticed something else. The people whose names appeared in the claims database didn't seem to be experiencing obvious mental health crises or disturbances. They went about their daily lives normally. They appeared to be functioning members of the community. Yet according to our insurance claims, they were receiving intensive weekly mental health treatment. I documented everything meticulously. I created spreadsheets of the claims data. I tracked the flow of money. I photographed the empty field where Dr. Castro's office was supposedly located. I compiled evidence that should have constituted clear documentation of a massive insurance fraud scheme. When I brought this comprehensive documentation to Wade, he told me to stop investigating. He said that my continued pursuit of this matter was creating problems for the insurance company. He said that there were institutional concerns about reopening old cases, and that investigating Dr. Castro could have legal and regulatory consequences that were better avoided. He also said something that clarified his position. Anna, sometimes insurance companies process claims because it's easier than investigating them. Sometimes people have arrangements that don't need to make sense to us. You're doing your job processing claims. Let others worry about the bigger picture. I'm sharing this story now because I've retired from the insurance company. I no longer have access to the claims database, but I have copies of the documentation I compiled. I have spreadsheets showing nearly 40 years of continuous claims processing. I have the address of the empty field. I have the names of over 200 community members whose identities were used in what appears to be a systematic scheme of some kind. I don't know what's actually happening. I don't know if those people are really receiving therapy and it's just being documented fraudulently. I don't know if they're not receiving therapy at all and their identities are being used for something else entirely. I don't know who Dr. Castro actually is or what the purpose of these systematic payments is. What I know is that an insurance company has been paying millions of dollars over nearly 4 decades for services rendered at an address that doesn't exist to patients who appear to have no actual need for treatment. And when I raised concerns about this obvious anomaly, I was told to ignore it and move on. If you receive mental health treatment on Whidbey Island or in similar small Pacific Northwest communities, pay attention to your insurance claims. Verify that you're actually receiving the services being billed. Ask questions if claims are being submitted for treatment you're not receiving. And understand that sometimes institutional systems, even those designed to protect fraud, can become complicit in allowing large-scale schemes to continue indefinitely. Thanks for joining us on another chilling journey through the Pacific Northwest's darkest mysteries on Bleak Fear. These stories remind us that sinister truths often hide in plain sight, in medical records, historical documents, and community secrets. If you've experienced unexplained phenomena or witnessed suspicious patterns in your community, we want to hear from you. Subscribe, leave a comment with your story, and help us uncover the bleakness that others refuse to acknowledge. The truth is out there, waiting to be discovered.